Hello everyone, welcome back to another stream. As always, I hope you're doing well. So, yesterday on stream, the first video we watched was Abandonware Should Be Public Domain by Mild Conviction. Then we had Elden Ring, Explain It Like I'm 5. Then, by Zahanjo. Then A Crucible Knight Analysis, The Strongest Warrior in Elden Ring by Ontos. Apparently this wasn't a lore video. I might go back and watch one of his lore videos because he tried to leave a comment on one of my videos, but it just kind of doesn't exist now. I don't know. Sometimes YouTube is really weird about that stuff. And then we finished off with The Rarest Enemy in Elden Ring lore by Zeostorm. So those were the videos that we watched yesterday. And the ones I have queued up for today are I Did Not Understand Dark Souls by MGM Corruptions, which I like the name, almost like MGM Productions. Then I figured we could go down the Souls rabbit hole with King Jiffy Coats. So, let me get rid of that. Then after that, I have Connections Between Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro by Zvoke, I don't know. And then Elden Ring's Gnostic Cosmology by Infomercial. So I had this one queued up the other night, but we didn't get to it, so hopefully we will be able to get to it this time around. So, that's pretty much what we have in store for today. So, Captini, Javier Campos, welcome to the stream. Aaron Salinas, I don't believe I've seen either of you, but yeah, nice to have you. And Mr. Yada, nice to see you again. All right, so let's go ahead and dive on into the first video of I Did Not Understand Dark Souls by MGM Corruptions. And the man who speaks, welcome in. A lot of new faces tonight. Holy crap. Let me know how the volume is for you guys. It was a little bit loud for me. Ah, yes. The jump scare. For a second, I was wondering if he just fought the Asylum Demon with, like, the broken dagger, because I wasn't, like, looking at the icon. I was like, oh man, that must have taken forever. And then I realized that's not what happened when it didn't drop the Great Hammer. Not that that matters, but I just thought it'd be even funnier if, like, part of the reason you didn't understand Dark Souls is because one was stubborn enough to try to beat the Asylum Demon with just the broken sword and whatnot. Hey, Astanex, nice to see you again. I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself? Yeah, that was kind of similar to my first experience. I went down to the catacombs. I defeated that first skeleton, and then when the exploding skull exploded on me, I was like, nope. And then I just kind of turned around at that point. That's a lie. I was stubborn, and I tried to progress a little bit further, and then I got down to the first part of the catacombs by the bonfire, and then I think I just turned back. I don't remember exactly what I did in my very, very first playthrough. Took you forever to get past that? Yeah, I feel that. I like the little montage of death right here. Certainly overwhelming. We've all been there, my man. I like how the captions picked up the O from the character in this. Wait, he was lying to us. Look at how many achievements he had. That was all set up for footage. Nah, but for real. That's just the name of the content creation game sometimes.
And that was where my first run of Dark Souls ended. After 15 hours of frustration, 15 hours of stubbornness, and 15 hours of contemplating how my friend could possibly recommend this.
So I do kind of like that intro for as rough as it was, because in a certain sense, I think it helps lead into the point of the video that he did not initially understand Dark Souls. So by having the beginning of the video not having any narration and just kind of showing the snafu of going through Dark Souls 1 for the very first time, I think kind of like lends itself to the theme of this so far.
My first trip to Lordran eventually ended in defeat. It felt like a total waste of time, so on June 14th, 2015, I uninstalled the game and soon forgot about it. Until May of 2016, anyway. Now, shortly before my return to Lordran, my friend and I got onto the topic of game design, and on this particular occasion, we landed specifically on Dark Souls. Boy, did I have a lot to say. I recounted my difficult journey about after leaving the asylum. There was this insane difficulty spike that I believed was in the first area, the catacombs. I just want to say, I died over and over and over and over and over again. Skeleton after skeleton after exploding head after skeleton after exploding head after exploding head after skeleton. I figured out that I could just bait these damn things off of ledges. That way they wouldn't be able to return back to light if I wanted any actual shot in making any real progress, let alone trying to kill those fucking necromancers. So that way I wouldn't have to deal with the skeletons coming back to life every time. So, to continue, I run into this skeletal Cthulhu dwarf blacksmith.
Be gone with you.
And it feels like at this point, okay, cool, I'm making actual progress. I walk about 5 feet out of his cave, and then I get...
It's really funny to think of, like, running up to Vamos and then thinking that's progress when he just, like, shits on the player the entire time. He's like, I don't want you here. Like, if that's somebody's very first experience of Dark Souls, there's just something cosmically hilarious about that. And I'm sure he's not alone. And I think, like, the biggest travesty of Dark Souls level design is that even if you did go through this hellscape and manage to get to Nito, you can't actually go through the door to get to Nito because you need the Lord Vessel. So you go all the way down into the Tomb of the Giants without even being able to warp or anything, only to find out it's a dead end after however many hours it would take to do that. It's crazy. The joy of Dark Souls is shared suffering. Yeah, a little bit. You never even found Vamos on your first run? Oh, that's interesting. I'm pretty confident that I did. Because I noticed, like, the little hole. And yeah. It took me a couple tries to get to Vamos. I remember that much. Because I did have the patches bonfire unlocked. And that made it a little bit easier, I think.
Mowed down by some of these BDSM skeletons, and they touch death me. So I finally just uninstalled the game. It's been over half a decade, 6 or 7 years by this point, and I still begin to sweat when I walk into this sort of new area and I pop up. It says like the catacombs or anything like that. I still remember all of this vividly in my head. This first experience, it was just so. Oh, a bell above, a bell below, says the crestfallen. I didn't even get to glimpse these stupid things. Like, I didn't even clear the first hurdle. And my buddy, he's got the gall. He has the chutzpah to say to me. He says, "Oh, so you've hollowed then."
Got him.
I still remember the smarm in his voice when he says this. And this is a term that I've heard before in-game. I didn't really think about it too much at the time, but this is something that the crestfallen knight in Firelink actually mentions.
Ah, your face. You're practically hollow. But who knows? Going hollow could solve quite a bit.
Hollowing in Dark Souls refers to a degenerative state that eventually leads to complete madness. The land of Lordran is filled with many hollows, many of whom have been lost to madness long before you even set foot into the asylum. Along with a select few, only dregs remain. However, one commonality that has been pointed out within the community time and time again is that allies and foes alike only seem to truly go hollow once they've given up. And with all of this newfound...
Yeah, and I also appreciate the editing trick of slowing down and reversing the footage to keep it on what you want. I've done that a time or two myself.
information, that's when I begun to realize how wrong I had truly been. With this newfound resolve, I'd revisit Dark Souls once again. And it absolutely had nothing to do with the clip of some dude killing some bosses with fucking bananas that I was shown soon after. I definitely did not get my second win and decided to reinstall the game because of that. Or you know what, maybe it's still a little bit too early for the bananas. Maybe it was the bongo drum. It was not the bongo drums. It had nothing to do with the bongos or the bananas. I picked the game back up just because I'm good. I'm really good at gaming.
Alright, I'll be real, I have no idea how to pronounce this, but welcome into stream, Zalexis.
Lordran is an exhausted land, one where gods and monsters alike limp along. A land where a rot so foul has steeped in, it can be felt in every aspect of life, or what remains of it. It's a world where the system is so deeply ingrained in death and devourment. Everyone clings to what little life remains in themselves and in others. You yourself are no exception. You don't have superpowers. You aren't special. It's as easy to kill you as it is to be killed by any other nobody, let alone...
You know, thinking about it, it's kind of impressive how oppressive the painted world can feel when all of these dudes are pretty much just dregs. Like, they aren't really tough enemies. There's just enough of a spam of them where it can feel a little bit challenging trying to traverse this area on like a blind playthrough, especially with all the projectiles and whatnot. So it's kind of impressive to me to make like the trash mob still have relevant difficulty however many levels beyond the beginning area of the game. I'm the only one to have pronounced it correctly. It's just written backwards. I was wondering about that, but yeah. So that just confirms my suspicions. Captini says, you don't know if your laptop is really quiet, but you often have trouble hearing the videos I play? Okay, I'll turn the volume up.
Own somebody of significant name value.
So like this video, the sound effects are a lot louder than his voice, and I think that might be contributing it to it. So yeah, that was one of the criticisms that I was going to bring up in a little bit, but may as well just bring it up now. That I do wish the narrator's voice was a little bit higher.
You start in the same place that so many uncountable undead have started in before you. The only difference is that you have the ability to claw yourself along just a little further. You can choose to get up just one more time. Dark Souls is that, death and rebirth. It's about not giving up against insurmountable odds. You're told time and time again, something along the lines of going hollow could solve quite a bit, because the task ahead of you is so arduous. The gameplay and sentiment match. We all have those gaming moments where we're required to beat a boss in gameplay, only to be defeated by them in the following cutscene. Dark Souls never has a disconnect between how you're supposed to feel and how you actually feel. And that's because the land of Lordran is unforgiving to all of its inhabitants. Not for the sake of it, but because the world itself is dying. So why wouldn't you be too? In this way, lore is reflected in gameplay. My original issue with the game is what brought me to quit that first time. But the game's not unfair. Every fight you learn, every trap makes you cautious, every path has an alternate. Even though I started off hating it, ultimately I fall in love with what makes Dark Souls, well, Dark Souls. Oh, and there's also the combat. It's basically a fighting game.
Like that is a super loud noise. I'm gonna turn it down. That should be a little bit better. What the hell is this? Like, my man's likes a lot of fighting games. I don't even recognize half of these.
Dark Souls is not an action-adventure game, nor is it a hack and slash. While fighting bosses and regular enemies is a little bit different from PvP, it holds a lot of the same principles that traditional fighting games have. To get to the real meat and potatoes, let's talk about what I think are, in general, the 4 phases of fighting gameplay. It all starts with the neutral game. A phase of gameplay where 2 players poke, prod, and wait for the other to make a significant enough mistake, or attempt to enter their preferred distance, such as a grappler wishing to be close up, or a zoner trying to create space. The punish game, where either yourself or your opponent makes a significant enough mistake that the other can capitalize on it. Whipping ahead is one such scenario that can lead to a disadvantageous state.
Frame data. How do you get the Taurus demon up there? I have no idea, man.
Usually by combo, special move.
So I'm going to be real. I don't like a lot of the fighting games where they're more combo based because it just feels like a more elaborate version of Solitaire where it just takes a lot of precise inputs to keep your opponent locked up for the most part. And so that just kind of makes me get disinterested really quickly. Although I think as far as like the combat style works, it works pretty well for DBZ to have it be so bombastic and flamboyant and flashy and all that. So I don't know. In other words, I just kind of prefer the simplicity of Smash, which is kind of funny because like the skill floor for Smash Brothers is extremely low and the skill ceiling is also really high. I don't know if I'd call it extremely high, but it's pretty far up there despite how simple the game is. Tekken is best, Flow's the best, DBZ is great, but not the 2D auto combo one. It's been a really long time since I've played the Tekken games, so I don't have a strong handle on how they actually play.
While it might not be a traditional system, Dark Souls has light attacks that can be chained together, just like any other combo. Even though I said there are 4 stages, I believe that the last 2 are like different sides of the same coin. I like to call them the recovery and pressure phases. Most modern fighting games have systems in place to not only discourage attempting infinite combos, but also to make them impossible. If such limitations were not in place, one mistake could lead to the end of a game with no room for counterplay. For example, some of these systems that discourage infinites can be seen in games like Dragon Ball FighterZ, where tapering damage makes hits become negligible the longer the combo chain. This makes it so that if infinites are in fact possible, they require near perfect execution because again, the longer the combo, the less the damage per hit. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 has a mechanic known as hit stun deterioration. For every hit that you land on an opponent, the amount of frames that keep them in place and prevent them from reacting are reduced as your combo count increases. So the longer a chain continues for, the shorter the duration of time the stun is active compared to a fresh hit with the same type stunning them for longer.
Those are some pretty interesting mechanics. I wonder how that actually feels when you're playing it, or if it just kind of ends up feeling a bit unintuitive, or as though it might be too difficult for players to get an intuitive feel of when their opponent is able to react and, do the exact same thing back to them. But that's kind of an interesting thing because it would kind of incentivize players to disengage from their combos. And I wonder how they kind of recover from that and how much of a timer there is on that kind of hit stun decay, I guess. Yeah, that's just kind of really interesting to me. New Tekken's coming Friday. Perfect execution if you look buttons pressed on the side and spamming one button. If you have millions of hours on fighting games and brain for them, it feels natural. Okay.
Dark Souls solves this issue through a pretty interesting means. It's through the use of its stamina system. Since every action besides standing or walking drains or slows the regeneration of stamina, this effectively puts a limit to the length of chain combos. Now that I've talked about why the punishment phase ends, the moment a combo has been completed or dropped, the player in the advantageous state will enter the pressure phase with the goal of returning to a previous phase of play to pile on more damage. From the other side of things, the player in the disadvantageous state enters the recovery phase, attempting to return to either neutral, or, if they manage to get lucky with some sort of reversal, enter their own punishment phase to regain lost ground.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to pay attention to what he's actually saying because of the muffled audio of his voice with the background music going on. It's not even like exactly drowning it out, but it's distracting in a way where his words become less discernible to me. So I'm kind of glad that I've got the closed captions on right now.
By not understanding this core aspect of Dark Souls gameplay, I'm misinterpreting how the game should be played. Hack and slashes reward high or even infinite combos. They're not 1v1 fights that can't be interrupted. You're allowed to press your advantage while your opponent's knocked down. Who cares if a few dozen fodder soldiers are brought from 100 to 0 in the meantime? Playing against a real person is the opposite. You need to have systems that limit pressure, otherwise that combat becomes totally lopsided. Now, by not understanding what I was playing, I was hindering my enjoyment of the game in the first place, since even a low to mid-tier understanding of fighting games can help with your own casual enjoyment. You don't need to know everything about frame data, with safe on block, distancing, positioning, startup frames, recovery frames. None of that really matters, although it all applies to Dark Souls too. You really don't have to know the numbers, but just knowing that Majin Buu's 5M is the slowest startup in the game really doesn't help you if you don't know how to react to it safely and just start pressing buttons. If you do that, you get punished. So while you don't need to learn the numbers, Dark Souls is very good about teaching you what's safe or easily punishable with big telegraph moves. A part of the learning process is going up against new enemies with different attack patterns, kind of similar to different characters in a fighting game. This is where I believe Dark Souls excels in its teaching process. In the story mode of any fighting game, developers can't get away with placing the same character for multiple fights in a row as a way for you to learn their attack patterns. But a game like Dark Souls is able to place the same enemy in a level dozens of times over, and that helps reinforce those patterns. For my fellow brainlets out there, if you can't get a hit with your greatsword, either try a new weapon or switch up your timing.
Rip.
Now, please take this with a grain of salt, because I'm no fighting game expert. I do have an understanding of the basics, but that's really it. The best I can do is string together an auto combo in Dragon Ball FighterZ if I'm lucky. If you want to hear from people who actually know what they're talking about, this video's description has several links below, including videos or resources that I used to help with research for this.
I'll say that if anybody understands like the difference between a neutral game, punishing, pressure, and all of that stuff, they might not be a technical expert, but at least their overall knowledge of the genre is much closer to the level of expert than an absolute beginner. And to notice the similarities between fighting games and Dark Souls, I think is a very interesting parallel. And it might be pretty apt. And it's kind of funny because the other type of genre that I tend to compare the Dark Souls games to is like the Musou genre, like the Dynasty Warrior genre. And in a certain sense, like they're all kind of like fighting games. So it makes sense.
And with that, we're done. Well, I feel like I'm forgetting something. That first area that I ended up in felt pretty high leveled. I wonder if it's because I went the wrong way.
I love Cave's story. That game's so good. Hey Chadwick, welcome back to stream. Yeah, and if Captini says, if somebody ever tried to look up frame data, they're pretty deep into fighting games, even if they suck. Yeah, true. I mean, there's plenty of people... Yeah, to be fair, there are plenty of people who are, like, super into like the frame data and the metas of games, even if they don't have the technical skill to capitalize on such knowledge. I've definitely stomped a person or two who've used quote unquote better characters against me because they were less skilled players overall. So yeah, the frame bus baby, yeah.
So, what exactly is it that makes a Metroidvania, Metroidvania? First off, let's discuss not Troidvanias, or, just like more linear games. Imagine a maze. Kind of like this one. It may have many paths, but it really only has one entrance and one exit. There'd be side paths, which house optional power-ups, secrets, maybe a few mandatory bosses for progression. So I guess it's not really a side path, but it's relatively linear, minus a few necessary detours, I should say. To give it a couple examples, let's start with simple-ish and least complex, and then we'll move on to maybe pretty darn linear, a little complexity. Anyway, some easy examples to spot this stuff in. I mean,
hey Donut Swordsman, welcome into the stream. Nice to see you. Captini is so slow these days that frame data does not matter. You play meta characters because people don't get to train so much against them. Yeah. So, I was gonna say something. Oh yeah, the Chloranthy symbol is in Elden Ring, Dark Souls connection confirmed. And then the Chloranthy symbol is also in the Imperial Sigil of Japan. So Dark Souls is reality confirmed.
Let's be real. Dude can kind of only really go to the right. But don't get me wrong, it can certainly be fucking hard. Like, I won't be sub 4 minutes 55 seconds anytime. Honestly, probably won't be going below an hour anytime soon either, but go right, save the princess. It's all pretty easy to understand to the grand scheme of things. Besides not being a 2D side-scroller, Halo tends to have slightly more open areas that lead you along with waypoints. These open areas are more like jungle gyms that allow you to tackle enemies in multiple different ways. However, pretty much every area ends in a singular, proverbial tunnel of some sort that leads you to the next area. I can see it getting a little murky here because COD's a pretty cinematic experience. You generally are zigzagging between one location to the next, building to building. It doesn't really feel linear because so many missions that you do have you sometimes double back, or you get knocked from a singular location to the next. But again, there really isn't exploration in that sense.
It's really weird to see World at War footage. It's been a very, very long time since I've seen anything about that game. Or maybe I'm confusing whatever COD this is.
Same sense. As you get better at the game, you can't take alternate paths or acquire new skills that allow you to get to areas early. You simply get pulled along by your AI companions most of the time, and they just kind of tell you to do things. Most of the time, Gears is a very linear design. A few levels shake things up, but the majority is just point A to point B. There are a few times where you're given branching paths, but it really doesn't do much more than add to the replay value of the game, since the split always converges soon after. A maze may become more complex with more branching paths, but if many of those paths lead to the same location, it only adds to a surface level complexity. Games like Fallout may seem the most likely to fit here. They're more open, exploration-based, and you get to tackle most things in any order, but the core is just so much different. You can't unlock new areas by using the correct ability, or just by being skilled enough. Areas don't interconnect with each other, or circle back and create shortcuts. You can just sort of walk there, in a straight line, minus the occasional mountain or town. I realized that these more linear games had conditioned me, and I know linear may not exactly be the best word for all of them. A better word could be objective-based for some of these games. But anyway, they just didn't teach me what I needed to know. I didn't know that exploration could be such a big part of the fun. Red Dead has random encounters in its world.
Interesting. Yeah, I was kind of wondering what his point was because I might have like missed it looking at chat or whatnot. So part of the reason he didn't get into understanding Dark Souls was that he wasn't used to playing games that didn't hold a hand and make the objectives flow in a linear pattern is what I'm picking up right now. Which I think, yeah, especially when Dark Souls first came out, that was especially true of game design. Of course, there were like a few exceptions here and there with like Fallout and whatnot, but... Hey, Vice, welcome in. Yeah, I kind of forgot to ping the Discord that I was going live. That was my fault.
Secrets, mini games, and other optional things that you can do. Things that make you want to explore for the fun of it. But it's just different. They flesh out the world, and sure, you can effectively stumble upon these things, but you don't accidentally stumble upon them like you would in a metroidvania. If the goal's your destination, then stumbling upon optional content happens in tandem with that goal. You're always looking to further it. The path may be unclear, and who knows how far you actually have to go, or where even. If you're lucky, you may get a vague objective marker in some games that give you an idea, but who really knows exactly how far it is, or if you can even go in the same direction it's pointed at. You might have to go around, or up, or down, or below it, or who knows. Optional content's a way to rest alongside of an unknown journey, and
So, one thing that just kind of springs to mind as he's talking about the non-linearity of games and whatnot is just me thinking that as the precursor of the genre, I think Metroid works really well on a lot of levels, and I think one of the best aspects of Metroid is that it's more or less set on an alien world, and you don't exactly know what you're looking for, at least in the original game, especially, or pretty much all the Metroids, really, but you're kind of in an alien hostile environment, and you're just trying to make your way and survive, and the exploration kind of like lends into the overall atmosphere of the game, which I think is probably a little bit more difficult to accomplish with games with somewhat more realistic settings. So Dark Souls is kind of it, but not entirely. So how else could I explain this? Like, obviously we have the Castlevania games, but they're all dealing with like vampires and stuff, and you're dealing with wacky magic castles and whatnot, and a lot of that is also in play with Dark Souls. So I wonder if there's any type of Metroidvanias that are less liminal. That's the word I want to use, but I don't know if like that actually works. But anyway, like where they don't really play with reality or like people's expectations of reality. So that's just kind of like where my headspace is right now. Dark Souls would have been epic if we get to play a game of darts against Black Iron Tarkus. Yeah, okay. Honestly, I do think mini games in video games are a very underrated part of having a more robust and enjoyable experience. And I think one of the reasons why I found the original Final Fantasy VII so enjoyable, which it's super easy to overlook, is just how many mini games are incorporated into the game, for better or worse. Now, when I say mini games, most people are going to think of either like the bike game, the snowboarding game, or the submarine game, like all the Gold Saucer stuff. But even beyond that, you had pseudo mini games just spliced throughout, which really helped break up the pace of the game and the action. So when you first go into the reactors, you have to press the lever or like the switches at the same time. I would consider that a kind of mini game, even if it's like a one or twice off type thing. Another one is trying to perform CPR on Priscilla. And things like that were very common in that game and really easy to overlook. And I don't know, I'm hoping the next Final Fantasy does have a bit more mini games to like break it up, and it like takes itself a little bit less seriously. I don't know. It's going to be a really tall order to fill, but I'm really hyped for the next Final Fantasy VII game, just because it's going to get into like what I consider like the best parts of the original Final Fantasy. Legend of Dragoon and vegetable chopping minigame. Legend of Dragoon. I don't. Oh yeah, no, I never actually played Legend of Dragoon. I don't think. That's a game that I always heard a lot about, but I think it just like wasn't available where I was. Like it was either perpetually rented or the video game stores didn't have it, or when it was in stock, I was probably focused on other things, and it just kind of like flew me by, or flew by me. Yeah, CPR and Priscilla the Crossbreed. Exactly. That one.
Did you always know exactly where you need to go and exactly how to get there? It's nothing more than a distraction. Let's take this to a sort of extreme for a moment here. One of the biggest criticisms that I often see for Fallout 4 is how after your child's been kidnapped, there really isn't, I'm not exactly sure how to, incentive. There's really no incentive to go save the kid. Your character in every interaction is just frantic about finding them, but you're on the opposite side of the map doing something, anything. Is it wrong to play poker in a video game? No, but in a setting where traveling is just that, traveling, it becomes a means to get from one fight to the next, or one puzzle or whatever to the next one. In and of itself, it's not a problem that needs a solution. So the question becomes, why aren't you already there? Why are you going off and doing other things? You need.
So this is unrelated, but I saw something like the Dragon's Dogma 2 devs were asked if there was going to be fast travel included into their game. And they're like, no, we don't really feel the need for fast travel because all you have to do is just make traveling fun, and then players don't even really want it. Which is just kind of like, damn, to have the balls to say that is quite admirable. So kudos to them for taking that stance, but I hope it works out, because traveling can be some of the most tedious parts of gaming, and I don't know how you can balance players who are objective based or trying to get to a certain objective versus having an obstacle in that way in the form of travel or the difficulties that arise from traversal, I suppose. Dragon's Dogma 2 worries you, Mortis? Why is that? And also, welcome back to stream. Because Dragon Dogma's 1 failed at that? Okay, that's understandable. But I mean, yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have concerns, but I mean, not every game is the same as their predecessor, so your concerns are valid. I'm very curious to see if they're able to pull through with it. I hope they do, because if they figure it out, I just hope every other studio just takes that idea and innovates on it or iterates, so that way we get really cool traversal in every game. If the game wants you to play it, then yeah, travel is real fun. Yeah, and so that's kind of like my main concern is like, how do you balance the need or desire to be at a location versus the time and the commitment of trying to even get to that location? So in my head, I don't think there's a perfect solution for that. So I'm very skeptical of the Dragon Dogma 2 devs for saying that. But, you know, maybe they know something that I don't know, and I would be very interested to be proven wrong there. That idea... Oh, wait, you said something else? Remember the Paper Mario games? There was a boss that you could have fought straight up or did a massive quiz bowl instead. That idea, but instead of fighting Pontiff Sullivan, we get into a theological debate with the guy. Captini says, traveling in Morrowind was the best part of the game. You had to ready yourself for the trip with medicine and stuff. These days you just follow the compass with markers, yeah. Monster Hunter Rise showed Chadwick the joy of high-speed acrobatic technical nonsense. Traveling fast isn't a joy, per se, but it's a great time in comparison to loading screens and fast travel map buttons. Yeah, and then that ties into the whole idea of immersion, and as we've seen with Starfield especially, Well, I don't necessarily think travel in would have fixed it. Just having so many load screens really broke a lot of players' immersion, and because it constantly broke people's immersion, they started to notice the proverbial wizard behind the curtain, or the man behind the curtain, I guess is the actual proverb. So, um, yeah, I don't know. Morrowind balanced that by making you more knowledgeable about the area surrounding. This made finding quest areas easier. And yeah, that is something that I do appreciate about the absolute grueling, no holds barred type of gameplay that was more common in the 80s and the early 90s. And Morrowind was kind of like a modern take on that formula in many ways, in that they they gave you clues and hints as to what to do, but it was very immersive in that it's like, go figure it out, idiot. So there's pros and cons to doing that because it's a lot more immersive, but the biggest con is that it can end up being inadvertently frustrating if the players aren't paying attention or they don't understand certain steps necessary to complete their goal. And that could be like step quests or just like literal landmarks and all that stuff. You have many issues with Morrowind, but the world ain't one. Nice. Morrowind was cool because sometimes the NPCs gave the wrong directions and you had to suss it out yourself where things really were by asking other NPCs, and that sometimes led to more quests. Yeah, that stuff is really cool and really realistic in a lot of ways. Where if you ever do like foreign language stuff, you might run into the unit where they want you to like learn directions really well, and that's like one of the most difficult things to do in learning another language. Not because like learning the terms for like left, right, up, down, north, south, east, west is difficult, but it's because people are so bad at giving directions. It doesn't even matter if you understand what they're saying, because they could just be absolute garbage at describing things, and that is not like a language barrier thing. That's just like a person thing. I've noticed. All right.
Need to save your child, or you need to save the world, or whatever it is. So just walk forward until you get to your destination. In the original Metroid, an era where you had the Ninja Gaidens and Marios and Contras and Mega Mans, the goal is go right. That's it. Now that is the same thing for Metroid. The original first Metroid, it is exactly the same thing. The problem is, however, if you go right, you get stuck. You cannot proceed. Even in the first game, in of the series, it shows you that you have to go off the beaten path. You can't rush straight to your destination. It's not that the game won't let you.
How about we explore the area ahead of us later?
You just simply can't. You're not good enough. You're not well equipped enough. You don't have the ability, and you don't know how to. You don't know how to get around the Taurus Demon. You do not know how to skip Blighttown. Can you even save Solaire? Before any of this, I was just so focused on getting to that destination, but I forgot about the journey. It should be kind of obvious at this point, but Metroidvanias do share a lot of similarities to this maze-like structure that I was talking about. You can have multiple routes and keys and paths that circle back on one another, then bring you to earlier areas that eventually open up new paths. So much of these worlds are interconnected with multiple entrances and exits to new areas. Maybe it isn't the strongest example out there, but Metroid Fusion has hidden routes from one area to the next. It's just extremely apparent that the first Dark Souls, it just takes so much from the Metroidvania playbook. I can't tell you the amount of times that I said, oh shit, I'm back here? That relief that you get stumbling back into Firelink, or an old bonfire that you previously kindled, or even just finding an area that you've been to previously, just getting a shortcut, and knowing that you can get from point A to point C instead of having to go through point B, it's a whole different type of euphoria that you feel. So, in all reality, I know I said that Metroidvanias, they look like this, But it fucking looks like this.
Hold on, I want to look at that map.
It fucking looks like this.
Oh yeah, Super Metroid. Okay, yeah. There are definitely a lot of older games that had just as involved maps as this. One of the ones that stood out to me, which is kind of ridiculous, and my mom would like take a pen and like note like grid graph paper and kind of make her own maps for old Nintendo games. A lot of people did that way back in the day because you either had like the Nintendo Hotline, one of the random like soft covered game tip booklets that you could just find in like some random bookstores and whatnot, or you just kind of had to do things manually. So one of the games that like stands out to me is like having one of the most complex I don't know what you'd call this. Like, I mean, this is obviously like supposed to be a map, but let's just say overworld maps or just overworlds in general was Legacy of the Wizard. Why don't I just pull up a picture? Because me just talking about it isn't going to really impress what exactly that means. All right, hold on. Oh no, there it was. I saw it. This is kind of ridiculous. All right, so this is like the Legacy of the Wizard map. Hopefully we can make this gigantic. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to do it justice. Actually, it looks a little bit smaller than I expected, but I think one of the issues is you don't get a sense of like how big your character is. So your character size was about the size of like one of these blocks over here. So what you could see on the NES screen is probably about like a third of each of these rooms. So one room here is like 3 screens. So you've got, 9 screens here. Or maybe this is like, oh no. It's definitely a quarter. So this like right here is one full screen. So one of these big rooms is essentially 4 screens on the regular Nintendo. So 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's like 16 screens across, and I'm going to assume it's the same down. So 16 times 16. That's a lot of freaking screens of just like the maps and trying to figure out where they all connect to each other with like the random ladders and doors and stuff was quite challenging, because when you look at it like this, it looks a lot more linear than it actually is, because they don't necessarily flow directly into one another the way one might expect from a cursory glance. You fight that. Dark Souls 1 is a Metroidvania. All right, well, if you want to fight, the good news is that our buddy MGM Corruptions was also arguing that Dark Souls is a fighting game a moment ago. Yeah. It's a dungeon crawler? Okay. That looks like r/place. Kinda, yeah.
Now, for real this time, this brings us to the end with a brand new perspective and a lot more jolly cooperation than I'd like to admit for my first time. I decided to try out Dark Souls again. Now I have a fucking problem.
That's how you do it. The vacuum slice before there is vacuum slice. Oh no, the zoom in on the feet. I always liked the design of the Sanctuary Guardian, but it also always felt so out of place to me. And it interpreted the dragon's scream as come. Would I date Quelaag if the spider part was its own person too? Probably not. I think Quelaag is too hot. That was a lava joke. Plin plin plon. Is over the violins. Or is that a cello? And that'd be a violin. I was like, is that a low violin or a high cello? Kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes. Alright, so that was a pretty good video. I think my biggest criticism would just be the balance of volume. But overall, I enjoyed myself. I did like the comparison between Dark Souls to fighting games. So, yeah. I'm gone ahead and linked MGM Corruption's video into chat if you want to leave them a like or a sub. They seem to be either a new channel or a very small one, so I'm sure anything would help them out a bit. Alright, so it doesn't look like a lot of more Soulsborne content for me at least. Alright, so I enjoyed that one. So now that we don't understand Dark Souls, let's go down the Souls rabbit hole with King Jiffy Coats.
Welcome back to another...
Alright. Vegeta 311 also compared DS1 to old fighting games in one of his series. Dude is ahead of his time. I can see it, but yeah, I mean there's definitely like a lot of differences, but I don't really disagree. You saw it more hit or miss?
Welcome back to another video with yours truly, King Jiffy Coats, and I don't know what you boys and girls are thinking. What am I doing here? Well, with the recent release of Lies of P, I decided to chronologically go through my experience with the Souls series. Though I have not played Lies of P yet, I will eventually when I'm not in the country of Hungary and I'm back near my Xbox, or, my Xbox, not my PlayStation, because my Xbox I can play it on Game Pass. Anyways, my journey started as many others did, with Elden Ring. And the funny...
And yeah, I'm going to be playing Lies of P extremely soon here. Probably towards the end of the week, maybe Friday. Just stay posted, as always.
Thing is, this game didn't grab me right away. In fact, at the time, I really didn't have the money to buy it, but I had the money to buy it, and my wife was like, please don't buy the game. I know you want to play it. I know all your friends are talking about it. I know that you look up pictures of it and edge to it online, but don't buy it. Well, she was going out of town that weekend, and I was like, I'm going to buy it. Well, I bought it, and thank God I only had an Xbox at the time, because I don't know if you've tried to refund games on the PlayStation Store before, but it's like pulling an old lady's, like, taint hair. You know those, how old people have, like, those really soft hairs that already don't have the power that they once did. Well, that's like, and so you keep pulling, it keeps breaking, and that's how trying to refund a game on PlayStation is. And Xbox is much simpler. And that's not me to throw shade at PlayStation. I think PlayStation does a lot of great things, which we'll get to in a bit, but when it came to Elden Ring, I'm glad that I could refund it then. Well, I waited a couple weeks, got my next paycheck, and I bought the game then. And I'm not going to lie, I almost didn't buy the game, because when I did buy it, before I refunded it, I tried playing it, and god damn did I get my butthole just reamed. The first dog I ran into beat me. And then I beat that dog and went into a cave, and then a werewolf beat me. And then I ran into a guy, thought he was an NPC to talk to, and he stabbed me and beat me. And I'm like, this kind of sucks. I don't like this. Well, I gave it a
So I'll be honest, I do not like the actual controls and the feel of Elden Ring nearly as much as Bloodborne or even Dark Souls 3. Elden Ring feels oddly sluggish to me, but obviously not to the degree of Dark Souls 2 by any means. And in some ways, I think it feels worse than Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls in terms of snappiness. And I don't know, no, because I had this problem with PlayStation 5 and PC. So it's just like there feels like there's a lot of input lag for Elden Ring specifically. And I just don't like that feel of it. But with that aside, I do think Elden Ring is carried very hard by its overall approach to letting the player have absolute freedom to combat. That's kind of a lie. To having as much freedom for combat as they can, or the most freedom so far that we've had in any of their games. But I still do think there's room for improvements, whether or not that means like getting rid of stat requirements or level ups or things like that. I don't know exactly what a better balanced game of Elden Ring would look like in terms of providing players with consistent, tangible rewards for exploration or upgrading weapons and things like that. But I can say that I don't think what we have is currently the best thing that there could ever be. So, yeah, anyway. DS3 has input buffer issues as well. So DS3 has buffer issues, but I'm talking about like actual input delay, and that's different. Because I definitely remember in Dark Souls 3 that it felt some of my commands were queued when I didn't want them to be queued any longer, and that's probably my biggest complaint about the combat of that game in particular. But the actual speed of the combat and the flow of it was more consistent for me than Elden Ring.
couple weeks, looked up some guides on how to become OP, ran back into the game, and yes, I used all the guides I could. I used all the exploits I could. It's just how I beat the game. It was what I needed to succeed.
Also, I'm not sure exactly why he refunded the game. Did he say that and I just kind of missed it? He just said he bought it and then he refunded it, but I don't know why. Was it just because he was just test driving the game for a weekend? Maybe? I'm not sure. Captini hopes the next Souls game is an open world. It killed replayability for you. You like the feeling of comparing your new character to old ones in some parts of the game. Yeah, I definitely feel you on that. I just wish there was more change in the world of Elden Ring, so that way it didn't feel so static, and so that way subsequent playthroughs could be different from the initial one and still make traversal more exciting and whatnot. So one example that I often give as to what I mean by that would be how in the Mega Man X games, if you ever defeated a Maverick in one area, that could affect another Maverick's area later on. So if you kill Chill Penguin, the Flame Mammoth factory will have like all of the fire turn to ice, and you could essentially walk where there used to be lava because it's covered with ice now. So if you had a similar principle at play in Elden Ring where depending on what order you cleared the demigods or divine towers or something, it could affect the other parts of the lands between.
And as you can see right here, it worked out. Well, as you saw back then, here's me showing you some of my exploits, how I had to glitch some of these bosses. I cheesed some of this stuff. I had so much cheese dripping to beat Elden Ring that, I mean, some people might call it cheating. I call it utilizing the tools the game gave me. Anyways, I jumped back into Elden Ring, and once I actually used that guide to make the game a little bit more manageable, and then I started chipping off some of those bosses that really I thought were going to give me a tough time, and Margit really did. Margit's the one that, the fellow man, he's the one that jumped down and was a dickhead to me. I fought him over and over and over again, and grinded and strived for greatness, only to die and start over again. Even with the little OP guide I used, I still needed the skill to beat that boss. And the moment I beat him was like, okay, I'm on this game. I love this game. This is my shit. I'm going to fucking ride this thing until it's broken. And that's what I did. And after all was said and done and the credits rolled, I realized I needed more of this experience. I needed more. And I ran through the game. I think I got 90% through the game again. Or maybe I think I might have finished it again. I beat a second playthrough. That's what I did. I did a second playthrough, and I'm like, yeah, that was great. But I need something new. I need a new experience. And so I went and bought the entire Dark Souls trilogy. The first one I got because I wanted the more recent, better mechanics, a lot better polished gameplay, so I started with 3. Now, I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
The background footage is from Bloodborne, and we'll get to that game. But I didn't have any saved footage on my phone, and like I said, I'm in a different country. So I started with Dark Souls 3, and I'm like, okay, I kind of vibe with this game. I really like it. I liked the gameplay felt very similar to Elden Ring. I was like, okay, I mess with this. I'm kind of vibing. But it still felt like it had more jank, and I was like, yeah, they kind of polished it. I get that this is a previous iteration, but I like it. And when you buy a bunch of games at the same time, you want to go back and play them. So knowing that most people hate on Dark Souls 2, I was like, I'll wait on that one because I got it in a bundle with the remaster in 2, so I jumped to 1. Now, my problem with 1 when I ran into it was I found a cool weapon. I'd worked hard to get this weapon. I went to like some weird dungeon area, and I found this weapon that had a cool weapon art. And I was like, oh, cool, this thing, I'm just slashing through enemies. This is awesome. Well, the sword kept fucking breaking. And now, I understand weapon durability, but I don't like it when it's tied to the currency I need to level up and stuff, because I felt like I was stuck in this eternal loop of fixing my weapon, going into a boss fight, using it half the time, and then having to switch to a different weapon. And it was...
I wonder what weapon he used, because other than when I was spamming like the special moves of the dragon weapon, the great sword or whatever it's called, I can't remember the actual name of it, the one that you get from the Hellkite Wyvern. Other than that one, I never really ran into the issues of like weapon durability. And that isn't to say that like this doesn't happen, because it obviously affected him. I'm just curious as to how that came to be, since my experience was so different. So anyway, hey Scowleezy, welcome back into stream. You don't think you ever got a weapon broken? It's definitely happened to me like once or twice. I think it may have happened to me my first time I was going through the painted world of Ariamis. But I did screw around with crystal weapons at one point, and I had one of those break on my first playthrough, because pretty much tried everything in my first playthrough. But yeah. If you're in a boss fight long enough that it breaks, is that at +0? Not exactly. It's worse than a +0 weapon. So yeah. Yeah, and having bonfire aesthetics for Elden Ring, I don't know exactly how they could implement that to make it like work a bit naturally, because it might show off of like too many bosses connected to specific sites of grace. But yeah, who knows? Nonetheless, it would be nice if there was a more robust New Game Plus system, or something along those lines.
It was irritating. It wasn't fun. It was grindy. And the more I played Dark Souls 1, the more I realized it felt more like a grind than it actually felt a well laid out game, like a lot of people had led me on to the belief. And the runs to the boss fights were just atrocious. Like about Dark Souls 3.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting perspective from somebody whose first FromSoft game was Elden Ring, to go back to DS1 and to lament the boss run backs. I think is completely understandable, and I've often wondered what it was like for those who played Elden Ring first to go back and then play the other games. So hearing this feedback is pretty interesting to me. Just have a consumable to only revive the area boss. Well, yeah, but sometimes the area bosses aren't as intuitive as one may think. And some areas overlap, and some areas don't even have bosses. And so, I don't know. Anyway, going back to the video.
For me, right? I'd run to the boss fights, I'd have a good time, I'd go to the next area, run to the boss fights. The runs were never that far, and the little shortcuts you could find were really, really beneficial. I felt like Dark Souls 1, I never got that same vibe. So at that point, I realized, maybe Dark Souls isn't for me. Dark Souls 3 I like, but maybe the rest of the series just isn't my bag. If I don't like if I don't like 1, I hear 2 is worse than 1, so why would I play 2? And so my journey began again. I needed something new. I was like, okay, well, I heard these Surge games were pretty close to it being as good as it can get when it comes to polished, another studio doing a FromSoft-like, Dark Souls-like thing, but it was in a sci-fi world, and I love sci-fi, so I was like, I'm going to give these games a shot, and I'm not going to lie, man. I did not like the Surge 1, and I think I got them in a dual pack. Surge 2 felt like kind of an improvement, but it never grabbed me. I like the mechanic where you can
Honestly, I've never heard the comparison of the Surge games to Dark Souls, and I'm kind of unfamiliar with the Surge games, so I'll need to look into this.
cut off arms and stuff and get their weapon, but it just didn't grab me. It wasn't there. And like I said at the beginning, earlier in this video, I did not own a PlayStation at this time yet. Nothing really had shouted out to me on the PlayStation. None of the exclusives really seemed to say, hey, come get me. Other than God of War, I'd always meant to get a PlayStation to play the God of War games. But like the Spider-Man game, I really love Spider-Man, but I was like, down the line, maybe I'll get a PlayStation. Well, at this time, I was kind of getting thirsty. I was drowning in a desert of things I wanted to play. And as a last-ditch effort, before I bought a PlayStation, I went and got Sekiro. Knowing that this was the most modern FromSoft game previous to Elden Ring, thinking, okay, I loved Elden Ring. And this is, Dark Souls 3 felt old and janky, so Sekiro must have flushed out all the problems that I had with Dark Souls 3, even though I love Dark Souls 3, don't get it twisted in the comments, but leave a comment. I was like, this is it, and so I jumped into Sekiro, and this
I love that. Don't get it twisted in the comments, but leave a comment just absolutely shameless. I respect it.
shit felt like a fucking helicopter parent, bro. Every 2 seconds, I'm feeling like the game is trying to force me to play a certain way, and it's real handholdy, but not handholdy in like the way you're thinking, where it's like the game's like making it easy so that it can walk you through the scary world. No, it's just like it's grabbing my hand and yanking me in a direction, and I don't like that, man. I want to play the game my way, and that's what Elden Ring and even Dark Souls 3 and even fucking Surge let me do it. Let me try and play the game my way and really learn and fail on my own merit and try different things and really experience the game. And Sekiro wasn't letting me do that. And now that I think Sekiro is a bad game? No, I think it has a lot of cool things going for it. And maybe one day down the line I'll give it another couple attempts, because from what I've heard from friends is you try Sekiro once, don't like it. Try Sekiro twice, you don't like it. But when you jump in that third time and really, really flush out that combat, baby, it slaps. But like
I was really hoping he was going to make a Shadows Die Twice joke there, but alas, here we are. Yeah, S next, what you just described sounds almost exactly like Deus Ex to me right now. Bro hesitated exactly. The system glitches out and you're worked on without anesthetics. You wake up in a dump with all the workers taken over by the central computer. Interesting. Why is he using fire on Ludwig? This is Lawrence. My soul. You couldn't generate Sekiro? Could you picture autocorrect? I have no idea what you're trying to say. You had a really big margarita? Okay.
haven't had that experience yet, so Sekiro really was a letdown for me. It really upset me. It pissed me off with the combat. I was like, okay, I get it, parrying, and I don't know, it just wasn't vibing for me. So fast forward a little bit, we go to back to my hometown, and my cousin, he had a PS4, and he sold it to me for like $75. And at the I went and bought Bloodborne right away. I flew in going after Bloodborne because the whole reason behind me buying this game or this console was to play Bloodborne over any other PlayStation exclusive, over anything else the PlayStation had in its library. I wanted to play Bloodborne more than anything else they had.
Yeah, I don't blame him. And obviously, my channel is kind of built off the back of Bloodborne there. So I'm a pretty big fan of the game. I do think Bloodborne itself is kind of worth like the whole console price. After I beat Bloodborne the first time, I almost felt like buying the game again because I appreciated it that much. But then after the euphoria went away, I was like, no, don't do that. Save your money, you know? But nonetheless, it's definitely a great game to gift somebody if you like ever wanted to give more to FromSoft for like making this game. But I was gonna say something else on a more serious note. Oh yeah. So chat. Has there ever been a game that you have bought an entire console for? I've definitely done that for Smash Bros. I definitely got the Wii U for Smash Brothers. Playing Bloodborne literally right now? Hell yeah. And also, I don't remember if I welcomed you back to the stream, Global Sequence, but welcome back in. Scalazy, you also bought a Wii or a system for Smash Brothers as well, or are you just like hyping me up? Mr. Yada bought a new PC to play Elden Ring. I don't blame you. 3DS for the Pokemon? Oh yeah. I did that too. But ironically, I was really theming to play Pokemon, but I didn't want to play like Blue because those were like the first ones that I played. So I was like, okay, I need to play Gold and Silver, but it's been so long. I figure it's probably a better investment to play Heart Gold or Soul Silver. So I actually got a 3DS and I bought Heart Gold, and that was quite a blast, to be honest. I mean, I also have other 3DS games, but that's like what I got it for, essentially. Chadwick got a Switch to play Breath of the Wild 2 years later. I mean, it doesn't matter when you get it, but yeah. S next got the PS5 for the new Demon Souls. It's a little bit rough, but hell yeah. Reptile, welcome into stream. You bought Switch for Bayonetta 3 in 2018. Funnily enough, you didn't like Bayo 3 once it finally released in 2022. That's rough. Did you at least get any other Switch games that you enjoyed since then? Was the purchase worth it in the long run? Scallies always takes his brother systems when they're done. It's one of the benefits of hand-me-downs when it's not relegated to clothing.
And god damn it, was I gonna do it. Soon as I jump into Bloodborne, the atmosphere grabs me. Now, something about me is I love vampires, I love werewolves, I love that kind of gothic vibe. There's something about it I've always fell in love with. I mean, shit, even in Harry Potter, our Hogwarts Legacy, I made my little room of specialties, or whatever it's called, very gothic themed, because I love that world. I've always enjoyed movies like Blade and Van Helsing and stuff like that, and this game encompasses that. You feel like you're in...
You know, I've never actually seen Blade, I don't think, and it's been on my list of movies to watch for a very, very long time. This just kind of reminds me of the things that I still haven't done in my life at times. Mortis got PS4 and 5 for the FromSoft games. Nice. Reptile says Mario Odyssey alone is worth the whole console purchase. Nice.
The movie Van Helsing, but darker. And I just fucked with that so hard. And every moment I loved it. And even the challenges that I ran into early in the game, because yes, I used the Blood Chalice glitch where I became like level 1.5 trillion within the first couple days. But I had to grind through the Blood Starved Beast, which I think is a weird name for the monster, but at the same time works. Because if you look at the Blood Starved Beast, and don't tell me it doesn't look like a gaping vagina. Like a vagina that's just been plowed through on endless gangbangs of BBCs, and it just looks like a roast beef.
Right there, we don't need that.
It hasn't had its time of the month for a very
Come
long
on, man.
grinding and failing and grinding and loving it, but hating it at the same time. And the more I play the game, even after I was like ungodly leveled, I went through the DLC bosses, which this DLC boss you're watching right here, she laid the groundwork, which goes into one of my favorite bosses, which you saw at the beginning of the video from Elden Ring, which her name is Melania, and Melania was one of my favorite bosses I'd ever encountered in a video game. Like, stop, period, let's go, no babies this month. I'm just kidding. But at the same time, Melania put me through a gauntlet that I'd never known before. So when I met Maria in Bloodborne in the DLC, I'm like, oh my god, Elden Ring is more like Bloodborne than it is like any of the other Dark Souls game. It really has the identity of Bloodborne running through it, and
That's kind of interesting to say that, because I kind of feel like the opposite, where I feel like it's more closely related to, honestly, at times I would say Demon Souls than like the Dark Souls games, but just like the Dark Souls DNA, I feel is more heavily imprinted on Elden Ring than Bloodborne. I might have felt differently if there were also things like trick weapons or rallying and or limb breaks, but that's just kind of my perspective on things. Chris Hall, welcome into stream. What this gentleman has? Jesus? Yeah. Anyway. Maria gets hard countered by dashing towards her and parrying, but yeah, she's pretty tough. I mean, it's kind of like you could say every boss gets hard countered by parrying. I mean, not like you can't literally parry every boss, but nonetheless. Elden Ring feels like Dark Souls, I'm right? Thank you, I appreciate that. So, I lost my train of thought. Okay.
Bloodborne hooked me. To this day, I think Bloodborne is my favorite third-person game of all time. I don't think any other game will compete. I've tried almost all of them. Hell, I've put myself through like Spider-Man, which I like Spider-Man. I bought the PS4. I know that I said was kind of mid on Spider-Man because that's kind of my recency bias. But at the time, I really wanted to play Spider-Man 2. So when I got the PS4, I definitely bought Spider-Man. I had the Bloodborne, which Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of all time, and then I definitely went and got Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Spider-Man was a letdown to me, which I've mentioned 1.5 million times, but Final Fantasy VII Remake is still one of my top third-person games, but it doesn't even hold a candle to Bloodborne.
It's kind of strange to me, like, I don't know, I'm just so jaded of like what I wanted from the OG Final Fantasy VII that I just kind of hate the remake. Not really, but I do honestly think that the remake of Final Fantasy VII is kind of a subpar or below average game. Not because it's like bad or anything, but it is kind of bad in terms of like its combat and whatnot. Like it's barely functional. Like it's a step up above like Final Fantasy 15, but it's not that great. With a caveat that I do think the intergrade DLC with Yuffie and Sonon is much, much better. And like that feels actually pretty freaking good when you are able to actually manage the spacing on the battlefield between like the way Yuffie can teleport around and whatnot. So other than that, like I think like the Yuffie stuff is like a 6 or maybe a 7 out of 10, but I feel like the rest of the combat is like a 4 out of 10 for me personally. Like it's like a step below Dynasty Warriors. Chris Hall says Bloodborne's amazing. It's by far his favorite game. Every time you play DS3 when you're playing Elden Ring, when you last talked, you thought this game is good, but it needs rally. Yeah. Once you understand how the rally mechanic works, it leaves a hole to be filled in the other games. That take will get me cooked. You haven't played it, so you don't have an opinion. I mean, I don't care. I mean, it's my opinion, which means, I don't know, whatever. Reptile says, call you crazy, but you think BB and Demon Souls have way more in common? Like limb breaking mechanics and Bloodborne feels like an attempt to prove Demon Souls like gimmick bosses. So I know a lot of people really tie in Demon Souls and Bloodborne. I think most of that, or a good chunk of that, is partially due to how Father Gascoigne, or the one NPC in like the network test cut content, said Umbasa, and like everybody took that idea and ran with it. And other parts of like the Demon Souls legacy files were still in the code of Bloodborne, so people are like, oh man, this is originally a Demon Souls sequel, but it never was according to the developers. So putting all that stuff aside, I don't really feel like Bloodborne feels as much like Demon Souls. But to be fair, I also don't think Bloodborne feels very much like Dark Souls either in many ways. And that might just be mostly due to setting. But maybe like the size of the character models in relation to the camera and the movement speed in some ways is more reminiscent of Demon Souls somehow. I mean, obviously, I think like Dark Souls 3 is the closest to Bloodborne, but Dark Souls 3 is kind of like very different from the rest of the Souls games. The heal works the same in Bloodborne and Demon Souls. Oh yeah, that's kind of true. Captini likes 12 because you can make interesting engines for how your party reacts. I'll be honest, I kind of hate 12 because of like the not so much the combat. Okay, the reason why I hate 12 is because like Vaughn and Pinello are bland as hell, and I liked the judge dude a lot more. I think even Balthier would be a much better protagonist, and there's the whole controversy about him having originally been planned to be the protagonist of 12. But my biggest gripe with 12 came with how they implemented the awkward um, licensing system. I think that's what it was called, where like you could get equipment, but you need to like be licensed or whatnot to actually be able to equip it and utilize it. It was just extremely frustrating, and I kind of hated that. Bloodborne feels like Bloodborne. You're definitely right about that. Can't disagree there. Yeah, exactly, Mr. Yada. All of the games have relics from Demon Souls in them. All right, going back to the video now. Astynex always saw Vaughn as the viewpoint character, not the main character, like playing a Sherlock game as Watson. Sure, but I mean that doesn't necessarily make it more enjoyable for me. So just to give like a counterpoint, so that way I'm not just like straight up hating on it, you could make the exact same argument about Titus or Titus, depending on how you would want to pronounce that for Final Fantasy X. Uh, and one could say that Yuna is most definitely the main character, even before like the 10-2 weird shenanigans and whatnot. And Titus is kind of along for the ride, but they make it work a lot better in that game than they did in 12, by my estimation. Totally agree. Yuna is the main character. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Really elevated itself from the rest of the Souls series. I think it elevated itself from any Souls-like that could ever come out. And one of the reasons I'm excited for Lies of P is Lies of P really looks like it's trying to capture that Bloodborne stylistic vibe in. And from what Iron Pineapple has says, and if you don't follow his channel, go follow him. He is the voice on Souls game. It really does hit that itch, which I'm glad to hear, because even like the Demon Souls remake, I really wasn't a fan of. I don't like the health mechanic where you're constantly out of health, and I like the world, but it feels weird and like a chopped up version of Dark Souls, and I feel like Dark Souls, even Dark Souls 1, really smoothed out the creases and the problems with Demon Souls. And even though Demon Souls looks beautiful, and on my PS5 it really runs well, and like I said, looks gorgeous, it is a gorgeous game, it still didn't scratch that itch that I need, because I play with such an aggressive style in Elden Ring and in Bloodborne that with having to play things a little more timidly and a more Dark Souls like, I don't enjoy those games, and I just need something to fill that void sometimes, and every day.
So I'll get on my gatekeeping bullshit and say this dude wants to be aggressive, but half the time he's just like super over leveling. I guess that's to compensate. So he wants to over level so that way he could stay in the thick of it. I don't know. I feel like over leveling in Bloodborne may not have given the game as fair a shake as it might deserve. But again, I think people are perfectly entitled to play the games that they want to play them the way that they want to play them. So I'm just only going to give him a little bit of shit. And I do hope that if the initial experience he went through and like overleveled it, that he might come back to the game someday and not feel as much of a desire to overlevel, so he could have a bit more of a fuller experience. Because even if you do overlevel with the Come Dungeon once or twice, you could still have a decent amount of challenge in the DLC. So it makes a lot of sense to me that he would find like Maria a lot more captivating. But to be fair, like a lot of the base game bosses for Bloodborne are pretty one-dimensional or not too dynamic beyond the four intro bosses between Amelia, Gascoigne, the Cleric Beast, and Bloodstarved Beast. The ones after those four are a bit more lackluster in comparison.
I'm looking to see what new is coming from FromSoft, what their next plan is, what other studios are trying to do, like the developers Eliza P. Are they making this more gun and go style Souls-like? Because that's what I need. And I hope you enjoyed my little spree here, kind of going into my journey with the Souls games. And just know that I don't have any hate for the Dark Souls games. Hell, eventually I will try to grind and beat them. But at the same time, there's always going to be a part of me that looks at them and thinks they're not as good as Bloodborne and Elden Ring. Because those two games really changed my view on gaming. Not like gaming as a whole, but gaming in like third-person styles. I mean, I always liked a more hack-and-slash style game, like a Devil May Cry or a God of War, the older God of Wars. And not that the new God of War is bad, it just has that more parry-based combat, which I'm kind of middling on. I find it kind of disappointing. Same thing with the Assassin's Creed stuff. It's just, I like it, but it's not my favorite. This run and gun style slashing through, it's reminiscent of a hack and slash like Devil May Cry, but it also puts in the skill gap that you need on a parry based. But the enemies never feel grindy. They feel well balanced and fair. And the only time it feels a little grindy is when you're doing a boss, but you're learning their moveset and learning how to rush through each challenge. And that's what made me love Elden Ring and Bloodborne. Is you never feel like you're at the will of the game. You feel like you're in control the whole time, and even Dark Souls makes you feel that way. But Bloodborne, it's like you're mainlining amphetamines right into your penis and just saying, "Let's go fucking crazy." I mean, Bloodborne, he's even using a syringe, so come on, that's a great reference, and you know it. But leave a comment, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video today. Like the video. If you hate me, go ahead and tell me you hate me in the comments. I love that type of shit. And subscribe to my channel. I love you all. Have a great time.
All right, there you go, Chadwick. You can go straight
Welcome
into
back.
his comments and let him know that you hate him then. So anyway, although like some of the comments there I felt were like a little bit much, I did actually enjoy this video. I enjoyed hearing about a person's perspective coming from Elden Ring into the Souls games. So this was a lot less focused on lore than I thought it may have been based off the title. But to be fair, like the lore isn't in the title. I was just curious if it was going to, but nonetheless, that doesn't really bother me too much. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, even if you didn't necessarily like everything that was said in it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and link it for you guys in the chat as per usual. If you want to give King Jiffy Codes a like or a sub, I'm curious to see what else they have. Sure, Wrath is terrible. Well, anyway. That's a chain of words you never expected to hear. Alright, so let's go ahead and transition into connections between Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro by Z Voke.
Alright, there's been a lot of connections between the
Let me back it up.
Alright, there's been a lot of connections between the 3 games and 6 DLCs of Dark Souls, but I've always wondered about the connections between their standalone titles and the Souls trilogy. One part that really stood out was that Miyazaki has foreshadowed his next games within his previous titles. Most of you are well aware of Marvelous Chester, who stands out with his Victorian-style clothing, and he should feel familiar since his attire is basically the Hunter's set, with top hat and all. And I mean, he even mentions how he's not from this land.
And I think one of the funniest things about Chester is that if he's from the future, then why the hell do we not have like more hunters like him other than what's his face? The Profane Capital guy. Although if I say Profane Capital guys, nobody's gonna know who I'm talking about. Not Hawkeye. Definitely not Hawkeye. Definitely not the Crestfallen dude in 3. I'm so bad with names. Leonard. Is that it? Anyway. Yeah, there's no other like hunter dudes in the Dark Souls franchise is what I'm trying to say.
But my favorite part is, if you aggro him, you actually never see him roll, and his only way of dodging seems to be this awkward backstep, which could be the prototype to the Bloodborne quicksteps.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that he didn't roll.
The other foreshadowing takes place after the Ludwig fight, where you'll come across Yamamura, who stands out with his Eastern-style clothing. And although it might not be that obvious in-game, the concept art really hits the mark. And this style of design looks like a character out of Sekiro, and could possibly be the startings of the game. But there's one connection that we all love to hate, and Patches has shown up in every game since Demon's Souls. I mean, even in Bloodborne he makes his return as probably the grossest NPC. But for Sekiro, there seems to be nothing. Although there is one likely option, and Anayama the Peddler has more than just a few similar traits. When we first meet him in the Hirata estate, he mentions of a 3-story pagoda where some kind of treasure is kept. And intentional or not, this is a trap, as guarding the treasure is that relentless purple ninja that I could just not beat. But that's just scratching the surface.
Yeah, that ministry official dude is extremely difficult, and it's so funny to me that that thing isn't actually even a boss. And by the same token that it's funny, it's also annoying to me that he's just kind of chilling there, and it isn't really set up that he's like a ministry official and we've got like these different factions going on. It just felt like some random dude just started attacking me, which I mean is kind of literally what happens, but I don't know. Sekiro's lore does leave quite a lot to be desired for me personally. Patches is in DS2. Alright, I see what you guys are saying there about whether or not DS2 is a Dark Souls game.
And we can see him wearing an eye patch as well as a coat full of patches. And just to top it off, he is also balding. But one of these connections goes back the other way. And Bloodborne has a specific item that makes fun of the Dark Souls series. You'll come across a shield, which is basically useless, and the item description mentions how shields are nice, but not if they engender passivity. And this pokes fun at the slower tempo of the previous Souls games, which in comparison do fall short of Bloodborne. And there's actually a Bloodborne boss that has a major connection to Demon's Souls. After being killed by Gascoigne, he used to mutter the phrase Umbasa. And
okay, so the music is a little bit loud with this voice, especially with the extra voices with like Gascoigne and whatnot. Just a little bit of a content creator note there.
this detail was brought to light by Lance McDonald, so check him out. But if you've played Demon's Souls, Umbasa is a very popular expression, although it was cut out of the game, so it was likely 2 on the mark. Another connection lies between the Tower of Latria Heart and the Brain of Mensis. Both these amalgamations of flesh are slowly being released from their chains, with the only difference being one falling into the void and the other splatting. But the Tower of Latria heavily inspired the Upper Cathedral Ward as well as their Nightmare Brainsuckers. Besides their designs being similar, the way they're set up is pretty much identical. They're both placed in these thin hallways that limit your mobility, so they can stun you with their long-range attack and then go in for the kiss. But as I mentioned earlier with the Latria Heart, there's another cutscene
The feels when you learn the Brainsucker is just completely reused assets. The old FromSoftware specialty right there.
that's a little too similar. And the intro cutscene for the Dancer and One Reborn both kind of leak fluid and then emerge from this void of doom. But it seems that if Miyazaki likes something, he'll just do it again, which I have no issue with. And we see this again with Logarius' sword knife thing, which looks similar to the Soulbrands, a blade from Demon's Souls. Although that's nothing when you compare it to the Drake sword from Dark Souls 1, which...
Alright, with you guys talking Lords of the Fallen in chat, this just kind of reminded me of an email I got. So a couple weeks back, I had emailed support before like Christmas and whatnot and kind of forgot about it. That they kind of nerfed the hell out of the Hallowed Triptych and they needed to fix it. And I finally got an email about it today and the support person was like, hey, I got this email. I'm going to pass this on to the team, but there's no guarantees like they'll like act on it. But nonetheless, we appreciate you sending the email because that shows your support for the game and whatnot. So hopefully they got the feedback and will fix it in the near future because that was like, in my opinion, like the best, most fun item in Lords of the Fallen. So I really hope they unnerf it so that way other people can exploit it and enjoy the game as much as I did, or at least have more people enjoy it in a way similar to me. Dog snoring.
Shares a similar color as well as overall design. I mean, even this line through the middle is nearly identical. Now, DS3 has subtly brought back Bloodborne's main mechanic through an item, and the ring Pontiff's left eye replenishes your health after you start attacking, which, just like Bloodborne, promotes you to become even more aggressive instead of retreating and using a heal. Also, the item description does mention of people being transformed into frenzied beasts, which is basically every Bloodborne boss. But Sekiro has a very Bloodborne-esque area, which is the Mibu village. Within the area, you'll come across these slugs, which litter the ground, and we see these same creatures around the fishing hamlet.
Yeah.
So I wonder what the massive lore implications are, which is probably nothing since they're just a reused asset. Now, oddly enough,
I don't necessarily know about that just because they're reused. It's been a long time since I've played Sekiro to know exactly the context in which they appear in Mibu. But yeah, at least with Bloodborne, there's the possibility that the fishermen were like being controlled by the slugs and harvesting the eggs for the slugs and like farming the slugs and their eggs and whatnot. So I don't know entirely about that. And then you might just be able to think of them as like bottom feeders, perhaps, for the waters. I don't know. I would need to do a little bit more research into those types of slugs, because I don't know if they're supposed to be based off of like a real slug that I just don't know enough about to comment on. And then, yeah, okay.
there's another Victorian-style character that stands out in a medieval-style world, and many have come across Ringfinger Leonhard and his Bloodborne
This is the dude I was talking about, yeah, Leonhard.
as clothes, which in comparison looks a lot like the Yharnam Hunter set. And while researching, it was pointed out by user ToxyToxy that each of Rosaria's members correspond to a previous Souls game. Yellowfinger Hazel wears the Xanthus crown, which is referencing the old monk. Longfinger Kirk originated from Dark Souls 1 as Kirk Knight of Thorns. Kraden the Wanderer, who's from DS2, you battle as an invader on the Irithel Bridge. Leonhard as Bloodborne, and if you join the Rosaria Covenant, you, your own character, would represent Dark Souls 3. And I thought it was a coincidence at first, but from Kraden to Leonhard, it does seem very intentional. Now, there's no way I could not mention the Moonlight Greatsword, as it reoccurs in almost every single Souls game. But once again, Sekiro lets us down, and there seems to be no sword that resembles the Moonlight Greatsword. Although some do consider the Divine Dragon's weapon, as they both share that beautiful greenish-blue glow, as well as a similar ranged attack. But that's the best there is. Although there are some repeating designs that you don't really notice until you start to compare. And one that sticks out, I guess literally, are the massive pillars seen throughout the games. The
I was gonna say the Asylum Demon.
surrounding
Demon
area
Fire
of
Sage.
the Hunter's Dream has the stone pillars, the outside of Aldia's Keep displays the more natural rock pillars, and DS1 and DS3 have the giant trees of Ash Lake and Smoldering Lake, which aren't pillars but stylistically are the same. I also do want to mention the
And then DS3 also has like the similar pillars going on with the Medir Arena as well. Yes, the every time I see MLGS, I'm like Metal Gear Solid. Yeah, the Metal Gear Solid is a reference to the Metal Gear Solid. Yeah, the
almost elegant
schnozberries taste
final
like
boss arenas
schnozberries.
that take place in these gorgeous flower fields. The final fights of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Sekiro are just as pretty as brutal, and if the Valkyrie turns out to be the final boss, then Elden Ring is no exception, as we can see these flowers covering the ground. But for a
I
video
like
that
it, just calling her the Valkyrie 2 years ago. Yep, makes sense. Oh, yep, 2021.
I didn't think had enough content, I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of connections for these games. But as always, if I missed any details or got anything wrong, I'd love to know. And I appreciate you watching up until this point. Have a good one.
I like the music. Alright, so that was connections between Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro by Z Voke. So there's a couple things that I want to touch on that I'm probably going to forget a few as well. But one of the ones that I've noticed looking back at some of the Dark Souls stuff is that I've wondered whether or not certain things that were brought up in Dark Souls 2 and 3 could be oblique references to Elden Ring. So I don't remember what items talk about it in DS2, but anyway, as far as the God of Dream goes in Dark Souls 2, they call it Quella in English, like Mick Quella. Oops, not semicolon. Okay, so we got the White Ring, which says it's a precious ring which grants the protection of Quella, God of Dreams. Blah blah blah. Doesn't really matter. So, Quella might be a kind of reused name, but as far as the Japanese goes, we have Nera. I don't know why like highlighting it is gonna help you guys if you don't know katakana or hiragana. So we have Quella, and then in DS3, I think it's the shield. Maybe it's the might be the armor. Oh no, that might have been it. Yeah, the ethereal oak shield. No, this isn't it. There's something that talks about a spirit tree that is not a reference to the what's it called? The curse rotted greatwood. Oh yeah, this is it. The Spirit Tree Crest Shield. So I'm going to open this up in a new image and zoom on in. So this looks kind of a lot like the depiction of the Erd Tree, but I mean, oh wow, a tree looks like a tree. Big surprise, right? So the Spirit Tree Crest Shield says, it's a knight shield engraved with a crest depicting a spirit tree. One of the enchanted blue shields, the Spirit Tree Crest Shield greatly reduces lightning damage. So we don't really have a lot to work with that. Yeah, it's just like Holy Tree. I wonder if this shows up elsewhere, though. Okay, just all this item. Alright, so I think the Millwood stuff... Yeah. So I think the Millwood stuff is kind of also reminiscent of the, like, Erd Tree type crests. Yeah, I don't think there's going to be anything else with the DLC or trees here. Okay, so that's not too important. But the other item in Dark Souls 3 was the Aquamarine Dagger. And this kind of reminds me of the Glintstone Blade. So it's a dagger fitted with an aquamarine crystal, kind of like glintstone, engraved with a prayer in the old tongue to ward off incident. Perhaps it was a parting gift given to one sent off on great travels. And then the Crystal Blade skill releases magic from the aquamarine crystals, creating a fleeting blue crystal blade lengthy enough to swing as a straight sword, which I think is kind of reminiscent of the glintstone blades of Elden Ring. So I wondered if these were originally created when Elden Ring was like still in the infancy of its development or whatnot, and kind of were meant to tie into that game. And there's probably some other stuff that I'm just like not thinking of right now. So other connections between the games beyond those ones, which I don't think people are as aware of. Yggdrasil, yeah. Didn't Elden Ring have those spirit tree lamps or something? Yeah, so if you want to talk about the bell vines, I think those are taken from Demon Souls as well. Maybe not. There's no Bellvine in DS1, and that becomes a thing in DS2, and then that gets repurposed for DS3. So maybe it was in Demon Souls? I don't remember. Yeah, they looked Norse, or took Norse axes, wood shields, Viking helmets, and so on. Yggdrasil, yeah. What are some of the other connections? I'm sure that there's some that I'm just like drawing a blank on right now. Anyway, okay. I'm just going to go ahead and move on into our next video. And I'm actually ahead of schedule for one, so I might have another video after this one. I'll just need to figure out what it is. All right. So next we'll transition into something a bit more serious, I suppose, with Elden Ring's Gnostic Cosmology by Infomercial.
Here's something for you.
Uh-oh, something for us. The glowing trees that you can follow to find something, you can't remember what they did. Yeah, I call those helpins, or, yeah, I know what you're talking about with the candlewoods. Everyone's miserable and sad. Oh, yep, they definitely took that from Demon Souls. Put that one in all the games. Yeah, okay, actually, that's kind of a good point. So the names of a lot of characters get reused quite a bit. So Yuria is a recurring name in Dark Souls 1. There was the Undead Merchant in the Undead Burg. The first one that you can... I guess it's technically the second one that you can encounter. The one next to the bonfire, sort of, not like the little tunnel with the rats, will like talk to itself, and he will reference Yulia. And the thing is, like, Yulia as a name is kind of written the same way as Yuria, so it could just be a bit of a coincidence. I think Carla gets reused, although Carla might originally come from what's called the Record of Lodos War, where that was like the name of the evil Dark Witch, kind of, sort of, technically, but not really. Anyway. Yeah, Yulia, the one you kill for the Uchigat, indeed. Borquapsika, welcome back to stream. Millwood, Great Shield, and their sacred tree disappearing? Yeah, I think that could be related to the idea behind some of the soldiers and whatnot in Elden Ring. Yeah, and Carla is basically just Yuria from Demon Souls. Yeah, Record of Lodos War, I don't know if I would say it was so good. Like, it's the thing is it's very generic, but that really isn't a bad thing, and I think Record of Lodos War is comfy as hell. So I recommend it if you just want something kind of low-key that doesn't take a lot of investment to just kind of like chill with. It's a pretty nifty show. Although I couldn't get into like the second version of it because all of the voice actors changed and it just felt kind of different from the first one for me. Oh yeah, that's a good one, Chris Hall, that the corpses in the Chalice dungeons are wearing fluted armor, which is kind of like a Demon Souls reference in Bloodborne. Yeah. Thank you. Alright, so now we have Elden Ring's Gnostic Cosmology by Infomercial.
Here's something for you. What's up? How's everybody doing? Gnosticism. I think that the cosmology of Elden Ring is very influenced by Gnosticism. I think it takes a lot of ideas from Gnosticism that are really interesting. So let's talk about that. So what is Gnosticism? This was it was not exactly one set religion, but it was kind of like a family of religious and philosophical ideas that arose in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. It pulled especially from Judaism.
All right, so for Infomercial, if you ever see this, one bit of advice is if you're doing your recording editing software and your voice is coming in on... Hold on, I should back up a little bit. If you're doing like any video editing stuff, I would recommend listening back to your files with headphones on, so that way you could get a better understanding of like where the sound balance is. Because right now your voice is mostly in the left ear almost entirely, which is kind of really annoying to me personally. So I would recommend going into your audio settings and then panning the audio to be a bit more centered for the voice specifically. Okay, so sorry, it's just one thing that always bothers me.
Judaism, but also grew up alongside early Christianity and was very influenced by things like Neoplatonism and Greek and Roman mystery religions, which were these cults dedicated to a specific god or goddess. Initiates would go through these secret rituals to attain mystical knowledge, secret knowledge, and they would be bound to secrecy, right? That's why they called them mystery religions, because the gods and these rituals that you would go through were supposed to initiate you into these mysteries. it was formally denounced as heresy by mainstream Christianity. So it did not last long. There are a couple of surviving Gnostic religions and offshoots of Christianity, but the time that it was really thriving and flourishing and super influential was the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. But we still see its influence today in a lot of different things, in literature, in books and philosophy, and in video games too, which is what we're going to talk about. So, what did Gnostics believe?
So yeah, who just asked it? Yeah, Methoda, welcome back to stream, by the way. You said, is Gnosticism the one where God is actually a demon and the real good God smuggled goodness in with Jesus? It depends, and I'm sure infomercials literally about to explain this, but I think not all forms of Gnosticism are the same, but certainly some forms of Gnosticism have like the idea of the Father in Christianity not being like the same, and so like Jesus was kind of like decoupled from the Father, and the Father was something else, like the demiurge. And I'm not like super familiar with Gnosticism's core tenets off the top of my head. Like I've looked this up like a long time ago, but yeah, it's just kind of like a very cursory knowledge on my part. You love the near music in the background? Hey Bella, welcome to stream. You love it when you're learning about Elden Ring lore and you end up getting a history lecture about the downfall of an ancient primordial empire that was solely located on an extinct landmass in the Red Sea. I mean, that's how it be, though.
Well, the first important thing to know about Gnosticism was that it was strongly influenced by this idea of dualism. So some Gnostic thinkers went so far as to say that there are two gods. There is a good God and an evil God, and they are locked in conflict with each other. Other streams of Gnostic thought didn't take it so far, but they would still say, yeah, there are good spiritual forces and evil spiritual forces at work, or just, good forces and ignorant forces that need to be enlightened, that need to come to understand these mysteries. There was an elevation of the spiritual over the material. So we've got these two different realms and these two different sets of forces, right? The material and the spiritual. Gnosticism would say that the true and good things are spiritual. But everything that is material, our bodies, this world, all the stuff around us, physical reality, is lesser than the spiritual. Some might say it's outright evil. Others might say it's not as bright and good and full. It's sort of dim and hollow. We live in a kind of dim and hollow material world versus the vibrant and real spiritual world.
Dark Souls reference.
These three things that I have bolded here are the three things that I want to focus in on, because these are three things that we really see in Elden Ring. The first is this idea of the monad. They loved the monad. They were always talking about the monad. The monad is it is the source of all spiritual reality. It's not exactly like God, but you can kind of think of it that way. The monad is this eternal, perfect spiritual force from which all other aspects of spiritual reality flow. It's kind of like a lake that has a bunch of rivers draining off of it. The rivers might have their own names, they're going in their own directions, but they all come from the same source, and the water that's in the river is the same as the water that's in the lake. So we have the monad. Everything that is spiritual flows from the monad. It emanates from the monad. That's the second point. There is this concept of distinct spiritual entities that have their own personalities and wills, but they are flowing from the monad, from this one perfect spiritual being. Some Gnostics in, texts like the Apocryphon of John call them eons, Aeons. They're not exactly like angels, they're just lesser spiritual forces that have this direct connection to the monad. And we have this.
I appreciate like the stopping and spelling it out, especially with like the auto captions. It would have been a little bit misleading there. So Captini asked, talking about Gnosticism, LP, have you ever played The Void? No, I've not. I don't think I've actually heard of it, if it's a game title. I've heard of The Void, but I imagine what I've heard of is different than what you're talking about. And for some reason, I feel like neither of us are talking about black cats.
This whole host of eons, this whole host of characters in these very dramatic stories. And one of the things that flows from one of these eons, from one of these lesser emanations of the monad, is this thing called the demiurge. So the story, again, in this text called the Apocryphon of John, this is a text that is supposedly a conversation between Jesus and the disciple John. After Jesus dies and comes back to life, Jesus reveals this Gnostic, mystical, spiritual reality to John, and he tells them this very dramatic story. So at one
there's a lot of really interesting stuff with the Apocrypha that is very controversial for many reasons, and maybe I should like regret bringing this up, but if you don't know what they are, I kind of recommend at least getting a cursory knowledge of what they are, just because it's kind of like this text or group of texts that have been swept under the rug by at least the Catholic Church. I don't know about like Greek Orthodox and whatnot. That's something that I do wish I understood a little bit better. Like, what are some of the principal differences between like the Greek Orthodox Church versus the Catholic Church versus like some of the most early other churches in Christianity and whatnot, and what they consider canon versus not canon and all that kind of stuff, because it can be pretty fascinating. Unfortunately, it can also tend to be pretty dry, but I don't know. It's just a lot to sift through, and really can alter one's understanding of like the foundations of the religion and whatnot. So, yeah, I was gonna say with the idea of the monad, I think there's like some cross-cultural threads that one can kind of find in common within religions of the East, or maybe the Near East back in the day. So I'm really bad at remembering like all of the Hindu gods' names, but in some ways, the way that Infomercial was describing the monad made me think of, is it Shiva? Is it Indra? I don't remember. But in one form of Hinduism, there was essentially like the god that dreamt up reality. And so the whole of reality is because a god is himself, but while he dreams, he's like entertaining himself. So like literally everything is some aspect of this god in a different version of himself. So like everything, like all the substance of reality as we know it is essentially the same thing, but just being kind of personified in a different way, which I kind of wonder if that idea is similar to what he's describing here with the monad, just kind of like a different take on the idea. And I think that can also be applied somewhat to the whole idea of the Tao of super ancient China and whatnot. So I'm sure there's going to be like a lot of differences, but those are just kind of like what my mind immediately goes to when I hear these kind of ideas expressed here. Russian Orthodox treats them as something to study, but not necessarily as canon. Interesting. Yeah, I have no idea about Russian Orthodox either, so this kind of... I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. It's like the Marvel universe, but with more genocide. A big split in the churches is if you take the scripture of the church as the highest authority. So it depends like which churches you're talking about as well, because I don't know how the Greek, the Russian Orthodox churches regard each other, and or how they regard the Catholic Church. So I would want to do more research on that personally. Yeah, the Council of I'm so bad with the names. Nicaea really wanted to stop teaching about God and focus on Jesus. Yeah, all of that stuff is super interesting to me, at least.
At one point, one of these emanations of the monad, one of these lesser spiritual beings, named Sophia, sort of attained a will of her own, and she wanted to create something. She wanted something to emanate from her, but she didn't consult the monad. She didn't consult her other, like, male spiritual counterpart, and she created this spiritual being called the demiurge. The demiurge is usually depicted as a being that has, like, the head of a lion and the body of a snake. It's like a chimera, almost. And she is horrified at what she's created. It's this imperfect spiritual being. She knows that she did not consult, the monad, the great one spiritual reality. She's created something that's almost like an abomination a little bit. So she tries to hide it from the rest of the eons and from the rest of the monad. Well, you can't really hide anything from God.
So I wonder if we could compare this to America and or the Omen twins and whatnot.
So eventually she is separated from the pleroma, which is just the word for, like, the place where all the spiritual beings live is the pleroma. It's this place that is infused with the monad's spiritual power and presence. She's separated from that. Her separation from the pleroma produces this grief inside of her. She wants to come back. She wants to be integrated back into this community. And that desire and longing, that's the first time that any sort of desire or longing has ever existed in the universe in this story, because it used to be that everything was always connected, but now we have this separate entity, Sophia and the demiurge. So her longing produces material reality and souls, and those are things that had never existed before. Now, the demiurge has, this little weird lion-headed snake baby that she has. She has hidden this thing. The demiurge is ignorant of this spiritual reality. It does not know what its heritage is. It does not know about the pleroma and the monad and the emanations. So it sets to work creating a universe with all this material reality and all these souls that have come into being. And the demiurge, I think reasonably so, thinks that it is the one God, because it doesn't know of anything else above it or higher than it. So the demiurge creates the world that we live in today, the world where you are sitting and listening to this on your computer, on your headphones. This is the demiurge world that we live in. So it's responsible for creating this material world, and it invested human bodies with a soul or some kind of spark of divinity. Sometimes philosophers call this pneuma. It's just the Greek word for breath. So human beings.
Yeah, and that ties into, like, the whole idea of, like, pneuma for breath ties into, what do they call it for Nito and his, miasma. Yeah, death, and maybe not death, but, like, pneuma and miasma were connected in some ways. I wish I, like, looked this up before talking about it, but like, miasma is like a bad breath, essentially. Maybe not. Oh man, I just don't remember the specifics off the top of my head. I'll just shut up. Yeah, as Stella said, if we're interested in this type of topic, that she recommends Dr. Sledge at the Esoterica channel if you want to learn more. Okay, thank you, appreciate that. Methodist said, if you're interested in this sort of theology, you really recommend reading the web novel Unsung. It's got a lot of discussion on why a good God allows evil. Oh. The elevator pitch is that Apollo 8 cracks the crystal dome / computer surrounding the Earth, and the universe is a mass simulation run by Uriel as a trick to keep angels and demons metaphorical?
Have some sort of soul inside of them. A piece of us is spiritual and still in some way connected to the pleroma. So that is one of the reasons why human beings suffer in Gnosticism, is because we are sort of trapped in these spiritual bodies, or in these physical bodies, but we have a spiritual side to us that wants to go rejoin the pleroma. So the demiurge creates the world. Archons are these beings in Gnostic philosophy that rule over these material realms that we have. And again, sometimes they're painted as totally evil. Other times they're just sort of semi-hostile or just ignorant. They are flawed spiritual beings. So everything that they do carries down some of those flaws with them. You know, because the demiurge is imperfect, it created an imperfect world. This is sort of how Gnostics dealt with the problem of evil and pain and suffering. The classic question, right? If you've ever taken any kind of philosophy or theology class, if God is good and all-powerful, why do people suffer? Is God incapable of preventing suffering? Does God ordain suffering? Well, either of those answers would mean that God is either not all-powerful or he's not good. Well, Gnostics said, you know, we'll take.
And of course, that's also predicated on the belief that suffering in and of itself is not good, which, I mean, seems very intuitive for us at least, but there could be a bigger reason for it. Not that I'm like a proponent of this idea, but I'm just saying that if God is all good and all powerful, then if suffering exists, that must mean that suffering isn't necessarily not good, I guess.
Take door number 2. The God that created this world that we live in is bad. Bad, ignorant, imperfect, and that's why there is suffering. That God is not worthy of worship. So we should turn our attention towards the monad, towards this one perfect, eternal spiritual being. And through our understanding of these esoteric concepts and mysteries, we can connect our spirits back to spiritual reality. So that is sort of how the demiurge and archons work. Basically, it is a philosophy, it's a religion of a former unity, and then current separation, and then a promised future unity through this mystical experience, through this hidden knowledge.
Let chaos take the world. Yeah. Redeemed Zoomer has a 10-minute video on the differences in Christian denominations and one on the different scripture translations that might tickle the linguistic nerds out there. All right, thank you. Yeah, Scout Lazy, if you wouldn't mind like leaving a comment on the video itself to remind me to look at that stuff, that helps out a lot more than when I'm in the midst of the stream.
So that is Gnosticism in brief. Again, I could go way deeper on this. Other people have gone way deeper on this. I have barely even scratched the surface, but those are the important things we need to know for our next discussion, which is about... Somebody's weed whacking outside, I think. That's okay. We're just going to keep going. Elden Ring.
See, told you guys chaos will take the world.
How does Elden Ring fit into all of this? Well, there's a character named Hyetta, and at the end of her quest line, we get some dialogue from her that is very, very interesting. She is speaking for the Three Fingers, and I'm just going to assume we all kind of have a base level familiarity of what's going on in this game. She is speaking for the Three Fingers, and she says, "All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures and births and souls. But the greater will made a mistake." And later on she says, "What was borrowed must be returned. Melt it all away with the yellow chaos flame until all is one again. No more fractures, no more birth." So that sounds a whole lot like the story we just heard. At one point there was one great, whoever this being was, or maybe it wasn't even a being, it was just a totally perfect and unseparated creation, right? It's like the monad. And then after that, we had some kind of shattering or fracture. separation happened. And it seems to kind of imply that the greater will was the cause of this separation, which would put the greater will in the game sort of in the position of the demiurge.
And this is kind of also dependent on how one reads the Japanese, because the Japanese is woefully ambiguous as to whether or not the idea of the one great and or the greater will could be conflated. It's kind of hard to talk about, but let's see here. So we've got Hayata's dialogue. Allow me to divine the words. All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures and births and souls, but the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, blah, blah, blah. Everyone born of the mistake. So, right here, she's saying, like, everything was broken off of the great one, essentially. Like, the big one, essentially, is literally how one can translate that. So it was, like, fragmented. Then it was born, and people, or not like people, but they gained hearts, but it doesn't literally mean heart. The word kokoro in Japanese is something that's borderline untranslatable into English, because the idea of kokoro encompasses like the literal heart to a very, very small degree. The idea of like the heart of a person, like metaphorically speaking, as well as a lot of their mentality is kind of incorporated or encompassed by kokoro. And that makes it really hard to translate directly because it isn't as precise as we tend to be in English. And so, yeah, anyway. All right, so what was I saying? Okay, and then, yeah, after she says everything is, like, fractured, born, and then gained hearts, or, like, gained will, gained consciousness, gained mind, I guess would be a way you can say that. But one of the issues, like, is, like, she's kind of speaking in fragments, so it's kind of, like, hard to put this together and make it flow very naturally in English. And then she says, but that was all the mistake of the greater will right here. So the issue is, even though everything came from the great one, the way that she phrases this doesn't necessarily mean that the greater will was any different. And so if you think about this, like, logically speaking, if everything is one, then there couldn't have been a greater will to differentiate itself from the one great. So some people make the greater will sound like more of an active thing that, like, worked against the one great. But if anything, I would argue the greater will should have been part of the one great to some extent. So you might be able to place blame onto the greater will retroactively, and that could still make a kind of sense. But I just wanted to bring this up. Hopefully that made sense to you guys, despite like all the choppiness of my off-the-cuff translations there. Hey, Drew Wang, welcome back to stream. Sounds similar to the high-tier stuff going on in the Elder Scrolls. Don't get into Elder Scrolls Cosmology, you'll go insane. Yeah, I don't intend to. If romance anime has taught Mr. Yada anything, it's that the Kokoro goes doki doki. Yeah. A lot of this would also fit into the story of the Kabbalah, indeed. How God made empty space into himself and then created Adam Kadaman? I actually don't know that word. Stuff happens and things separate into Sephiroths. Okay, cool. Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting, like, how many creation myths end up being similar in one way or another to each other.
This separated, distinct spiritual entity that was responsible for further separating reality, further fracturing it, and giving rise to things like human beings and souls and material reality. Now, here's what...
Yeah, and I guess The other thing that I should mention with like the one great, I don't have a problem with the English localization for that term, although I've seen like other people have some issues with this. Um, the way that it is presented in Japanese makes it very okay. So maybe you could like read it backwards. That rather well, that kind of presents its own problems. So rather than looking at it as like the one great, technically a more like literal slash natural way to read it would be like the great one. But of course, if you say like the great one, that can imply great ones as in Bloodborne. So to me, it'd be understandable why they would have wanted to not use that phrasing specifically. So why is this important? If everything comes from the great one, at least in the Japanese, it makes it sound as though like it's all one as opposed to just like one specific great thing. So it makes it sound a lot more unified in the Japanese is what I'm trying to get across here. So sorry to go on one of those tangents again. Should have called it the Big Boy and called it a day. Yeah, maybe they should have.
Where it gets interesting. I think that the outer gods in Elden Ring are examples of archons. They are these distinct spiritual beings that are trying to exert their will over the world, but they can't do it directly because they are spiritual, right? We never actually meet. I think this is a complete list of at least all the confirmed outer gods. The Formless Mother, the Frenzied Flame, the God of Scarlet Rot, and the Ghost Flame God. We never meet any.
Okay, cool. So I think I like listed these four exactly. So maybe he had a more complete list. But yeah, that's kind of what I thought yesterday on stream. But yeah, I like that idea of the outer gods being kind of equivalent to archons. I don't know how I feel about the outer god thing specifically to the Empyrean vessels and demigods. So I'm curious to see where he's going to go with that.
Of the
No fire giant god? Okay, yeah, maybe that one's missing. But is it an outer god? Yeah, I guess it kind of is, yeah.
These in person. Even the Frenzied Flame, we meet the three fingers, but that's not the Frenzied Flame. That's like a vessel or something that is enacting the will of the Frenzied Flame. That's not the actual outer god. So these are distinct spiritual beings. They need some kind of material vessel to exert their will on the lands between. And I think that they're in some way connected to this former unity, right? I don't think they come from somewhere else. I think they're other things like the greater will. They are competing with each other to gain power and control over this material existence that we have now. One of them has kind of a unique goal, right? The Frenzied Flame wants to return everything to that former unity instead of continually separate things. So these outer gods are trying to find these Empyrean vessels to exert their will. Right, the Formless Mother is probably using Mikola with the help of Moog. The Greater Will was using Marika. I don't know what the Ghost Flame God was trying to do. The God of Scarlet Rot was using Melania. And the Frenzied Flame chooses us, which is interesting because we are not an Empyrean. So the Frenzied Flame's goals are sort of distinct from these other archons or these outer gods here.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea that I might want to explore more sometime. That the Frenzied Flame, if it truly is an outer god, which is kind of implied by the unalloyed gold needle and whatnot, or Mikola's unalloyed needle, whatever you want to call it, that it doesn't really need the vessel of an Empyrean or anything like that, and it can choose the Tarnished to enact its vision on the world. Huh. And I guess, like, in many ways, the Frenzied Flame ending does show that a god isn't strictly necessary, although it is a bit ambiguous what exactly really happens at the end of that ending, especially if you didn't already sacrifice Melina to burn the Erd Tree to begin with. And so if, like, Melina's still around, maybe there's other people still around, maybe there's the potential that the Tarnished as the Lord of Frenzied Flame can still get got by destined death and whatnot. So I don't know. Empyrean might just be a greater will thing. You don't think we should make blanket statements about that they're there for every god? Yeah, and that's kind of why I like to explore this stuff, because I don't think you should always take everything just strictly at face value. I think it should take a little bit of extra thought on the outside. But nonetheless, I also think even if there are some issues with an idea, there might be more that can be gained from it in other aspects. So, yeah. I like this idea so far, even if I don't disagree, even if I don't necessarily agree with everything. Chad thinks it's all metaphors for human beliefs and control systems? Maybe. Yeah, as Mr. Yada was saying, it's interesting that when you inherit the flame, you're the Lord of Frenzy Flame and not the vessel god of the Frenzy Flame. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking there a moment ago.
Now, another thing that I just thought was kind of interesting was that Golden Order fundamentalism might agree more with the Frenzied Flame than they think they do. Even though they have imprisoned this thing, you know, way below Lane Dell, they're terrified of it, they're trying to keep it down. In this incantation that you can find called Law of Regression, the description here says, the fundamentalists describe the Golden Order through the powers of regression and causality. Regression is the pull of meaning that all things yearn eternally to converge. So it sounds like at least the fundamentalists understand that there is this pull for things to return to this unity, to this shared spiritual experience that used to be the status quo. Things are trying to get back to that. They want to converge back together. They want to regress back to the former state. So, you know, they are fighting to keep that from happening, but it seems like they at least understand that this is a law of the universe, that things are sort of pulling back together. The last thing I wanted to talk about here was just the idea of chaos. Has showed up a few times in FromSoftware's games. Obviously, it shows up a lot in world religions and philosophies. In mathematics, chaos is the name for a pattern that is just too complex to be discerned or understood. Because at least the physical universe that we live in, nothing is actually random. Nothing is actually truly random or truly chaotic, because at the very base level of our reality, we have these physical laws that are governing things. Or at least, you know, we think that we have these laws and we think that we understand them, and we're striving to understand them.
It's absolutely wild to me that pi as a digit is I can't exactly say random, because it's essentially like a fraction, but you know, like it's not a round number or like a number that stops, a repeating number. I guess it doesn't like technically repeat because it's anyway. I hope you guys are like picking up what I'm saying there. So why pi exactly? Just because like the idea of trying to calculate the area, but we don't get a precise area based off the decimal system or the 100th place. It's just kind of wild, because to me that kind of shows that you don't ever really get an exact answer of what the area of a circle is. In some ways it's kind of an approximation if you don't use fractions, but nonetheless there are so many digits to pi. Apparently you can calculate the width of the circumference of the known observable universe to the degree of certainty between the space of a hydrogen atom to its like nucleus, or maybe it was like the proton, I don't exactly remember, with using only 41 digits of pi. Which, I mean, that's kind of like a lot of digits, but like that's crazy accurate how that is for like how few numbers necessary it is to use that. Anyway. law of regression equals human instrumentality project. I don't know about that. I was talking about this on stream a little bit yesterday, that it seems that immutability is a byproduct of regression. So I don't know if regression is meant to go all the way back to the beginning despite its description. And I wonder if it's only a limited force of regression that is being consistently applied by the Golden Order to keep things in a state of limbo, or stasis, as I like to call it.
At least for a lot of scientists and mathematicians, chaos as a pure thing, like true randomness, doesn't really exist. But most of the time, chaos, especially when you're talking about ancient religions or the ancient roots of modern religions, is this idea of infinite potential or primordial creation. There are lots and lots of different religions that have a story of some sort of god or pantheon of gods bringing order to chaos and creating the world that we have today. And in many of those religions, that is seen as an unambiguously good thing, right? This chaos, this darkness, this sort of bubbling stew of nothingness that held everything inside of it, that was waiting to be ordered. It needed to be ordered by these divine figures, and it was good that they did that. Gnosticism, and possibly Elden Ring through this character of Hayeda, sort of asks a very interesting question, which is, was that a good thing? Was this ordering of chaos a good thing? Because before, everything was one. It was all connected. There was no separation. There was no desire. There was no grief or mourning or pain, because how could there be if everything was just one thing? That's a very Buddhist idea, this idea that...
Yeah, I was about to say, now this is where we get all of our Evangelion parallels, and the whole idea of human instrumentality is that if everybody merges together, there is no differences between anybody, because there can't be a difference of bodies because they're all one thing. And so without disparity, you don't have any suffering. So that's kind of like the end goal of the human instrumentality project. It's essentially a return to the Age of Ancients, and ties into that kind of Buddhist or Hinduist belief that I had mentioned earlier in the stream, where we're just kind of all the fractured essences of one God while he sleeps. And so whenever he wakes up, the universe ends, and then the universe begins again, like once he goes back to sleep, and kind of differentiates himself in his dreams. So that kind of like ties back into Eva, where Shinji like rejects the human instrumentality project because he holds his identity selfishly, and he learns exactly who he is by understanding what he is not, and by being able to measure himself against others, he's able to get a better understanding of himself, and that's just like something he cherishes. And so like that same principle, I think in some ways can be applied to Dark Souls with the whole Age of Ancients and the first flame inducing disparity upon the world, as well as potentially Elden Ring with that whole idea of regression and the one great and all this stuff that we're talking about right now.
That pain comes from separation, or the illusion of separation. You are in pain because you want something that you don't have, but you don't realize that you actually already have everything you need. You are still a part of everything else. So the Frenzied Flame, Hayeda, Gnosticism, their stance is that actually this separation and this quote-unquote ordering of chaos was a bad thing, because it separated people and made them distinct. But people like the fundamentalists and other most mainstream religions in our own world would say that this order was a good thing, and it is something that needs to be preserved. We don't want to lose our distinctiveness. We don't want to lose our individuality. That would be worse, right? We want to maintain the status quo of things being ordered and separate and distinct.
Like, depending on one's beliefs about that can tie into that whole idea of logos, which was prominently displayed in like Final Fantasy 16, where once you gain your own kind of mentality, you kind of have your own individualism, and that's just something that a logos doesn't let go of itself like automatically. So you'd kind of need to struggle against the logos if you wanted to destroy the logos, and so it ends up not being like a real. I don't want to say like it's not a real thing. Like the whole idea of logos is like a thing. Don't get me wrong there, but um, the logos does not give itself up for the most part. Methoda says, even if we all fuse together into God, you can still be in pain because you stubbed your toe? Maybe. But is it really your toe or is it our toe, comrade? Scaleezy says, alright, so the Godhead created is... Wait, hold on. Let me try to parse how you're saying this. I think you a word there. The Godhead created is and is not, and then they birthed their own souls, who then did the same. Somewhere along the line, all of the Ija and Dija were created, and then Talos kicked Elven ass. Oh, you're talking about Elden, not Elden Ring, but Elder Scrolls. Okay.
So, I love that you have both of those things together side by side in this game. It doesn't come out and tell you which one is right and which one is wrong. It just presents these ideas that have been rattling around in human heads for, at the very least, 2,000 years now, probably much, much older than that. And I think that is what gives this game some of its feeling of authenticity. A lot of video games, when they include some sort of religion that's been fabricated for the world of the game, it just feels so shallow. It doesn't really feel anything like if you've studied world religions. It doesn't seem nearly as complex or interesting or contradictory or confusing as real-world religion can often be. But with Elden Ring, I think they nailed it, because it is very confusing and it is very contradictory and hard to understand. But I think that is just kind of an honest way of looking at religion, because oftentimes that is how it feels to the people who study it.
Yeah, I kind of agree with him to an extent here that, at least with the whole Hayata questioning of reality, it's a very philosophical thing that strikes a chord with many who've like pondered these questions themselves. And so it makes characters like Hayata and the world they live in feel a bit more believable, to me at least. But with that being said, I don't think like the religions are as fleshed out as they could be, which isn't like too much of a criticism, but nonetheless, I do wish there was a lot more with the Golden Order fundamentalists and the Erd Tree faithful, and having there be like more of a separation or more clear boundaries or differences between like the two practices, and how all of that stuff changed when Radagon became Elden Lord. But with that being said, there's also the good possibility that if Radagon showed up on the scene, he could have either assimilated what had come before or repurposed what there had been in the past. And so what may have existed might have just been transmogrified and given a new coat of paint to look a little bit different, but be functionally the same in the new world order that Radagon instituted throughout his tenure as Elden Lord and whatnot. So, yeah. Despite me like criticizing Elden Ring's lack of differentiation a moment ago, I think even that could be used as an argument to say that like this stuff actually does kind of happen in real life. So is it really fair to complain about it? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe certain things could have been executed a little bit better, a little bit differently, but who's really to say and or no? Okay.
So, there you go. That is Gnosticism in Elden Ring.
Alright, so that was a really good video by Infomercial. Seems like a small channel, so if you want to give him some support, you can do so through this link. So I'm curious if they've made any other content similar to this. Well, you should invade an Elden Ring, especially if you've never done it before. This guy sucks. I hate Elden Ring invaders. I'm not really interested in the PvP stuff. Okay, I'll sub for like these couple videos here. Yeah, okay. Alright, so now we actually have a bit of time left on the stream that I didn't account for, so I'm curious what we should watch next. Something probably a little shorter, but not like too crazy long. Oh, okay, that one's too long. Didn't we just watch a Evoke? Maybe we could do Elden Ring's funniest moments or also its darkest? Why do cozy games suck? That sounds funny. Alright, let's do Elden Ring lore. Rosus doesn't exist by Square Table Gaming. I'll need to like go back and update my description and whatnot to include them on here. Captina used to copy stories from in-game books of Morrowind for your literature studies. That's funny. Did you like? Oh, for your literature studies. I was wondering if you're just like plagiarizing and like presenting them as though they're your own stories, because that's even funnier to me. All right, everybody. So we've got a video by Square Table Gaming with Rosus doesn't exist. On its face, I kind of disagree with the premise. So let's see if they can change my mind here. And I'll turn it up. It looks like the volume's low.
Sometimes it feels like every week I'm saying the same thing in different ways. Specifically that the many mysteries of Elden Ring continue to elude us. Every time we think we've reached the end of the rabbit hole, we find ourselves in a new warren with even more branching paths. In this episode, we'll be exploring another character in Elden Ring who's never physically met in the lands between. But unlike others, who were champions likely now long dead, we believe there's something other than death preventing us from ever truly encountering him. Today we're going to take a closer look at Rosus, the Usher of Death and keeper of the locations of many of Elden Ring's mysterious catacombs. Who was Rosus? Why do all depictions of him take on this inhuman form? And why would someone who seems, at a surface level, to be associated with those who live in death, cast golden light that pierces through darkness?
He is kind of associated with those who live in death, but also there's a difference between those who live in death and those lost in death. Sorry for the dog. And Rosus is technically more associated with those lost in death.
Welcome to the Elden Lore series. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for checking out our content. If you learned anything new or just enjoy our way of exploring Elden Ring, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every sub helps our community grow, and if there's one thing you need to know about our channel, it's that interacting with our community is one of our favorite things to do. Whether we're streaming, putting out polls, or just responding to comments, we think fostering a strong community of people who want to discuss the nuances of Elden Ring is an honor and a privilege, and we don't take it lightly. Even if you don't subscribe, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. And with that said, let's get back to today's topic. Your first encounter with Rosus was likely an accident. I know I was confused the first time I saw one of these creepy statues and was greeted with the message, "Guide and Gatekeeper for those returning to the roots." From a gameplay perspective, these statues are an ingenious way of helping players find catacombs and dungeons they would have likely overlooked. The light they offer guides us along the way until we find the site of grace associated with each statue.
So Methoda asks a really good question with what's the difference between living in death and being lost in it? Generally speaking, those who live in death are the way that they are because they've come into contact with Deathroot, whereas those lost in death just seem to have been lost in death, and Deathroot is not involved in their predicament. So, for what it's worth, we should be able to ascertain that those lost in death are a pre-Golden Order fundamentalist thing, and potentially a pre-Erdtree thing as well. At the very least, they should exist at a time when destined death was still in the world, which poses its own set of problems that I don't quite want to get into right now at the very least. Lost is like the spirit jellyfish? No, so, what are they called? Apparently the Tibia summons use those who lost in death, so let me elaborate that the Tibia summons isn't necessarily like the Tibia mariners in the boats, but the Tibia summons spell, like the 3 skeletal dudes that get summoned for that attack, are those lost in death. And those who just vibe in death. Captini says, aren't those lost in death ghosts surrounded by mushrooms? Maybe absorbed by mushroom roots. I don't necessarily know if those things are technically lost in death or not. I think that could just be a byproduct of destined death being removed from the Elden Ring, and so that way souls aren't actually like dying as they should, and so they're just kind of stuck where they are. And that could be a product of the Golden Order as opposed to like those lost in death. So with Rosus being the guide of the spirits to the spirit world, he is supposed to give them a way into the spirit world. So he ushers those lost in death to the spirit world, allegedly. I might be like confusing a couple descriptions there, but generally speaking, I'm pretty confident that's correct. And I think that system would have existed even when the what are they called? The Deathbirds were still doing all their stuff in the time before the Erdtree. And it could just be due to those... I don't know. I was going to say it might be due to like those who died in combat or whose hearts were singing at the moment of death and whatnot. That's kind of referenced in the branch talisman swords or branch sword talismans. Branch, whatever they're called. Anyway. So, yeah, I don't know if those ghosts are those who are lost in death or those lost in death. Yeah, Rosus boss fight in Shadow of the Erdtree confirmed. Yeah, he's the true boss after Mikola. Or the one before Mikola in Godwin.
And after activating it, the statue goes dim. That said, these statues don't tell us who they are, and it's not until we purchase the Imp Shade's note from a nomadic merchant that we learn his name. Notes sold by a nomadic merchant imparting knowledge in brief. Nothing can touch the shades of imps in the hero's graveyard. Only Rosus's light can give them form. Only once we find these same statues in the hero's grave, now equipped with golden light, can we put a name to the form. Rosus. The Rosus statues are uncanny and come across as contradictory. He looks shriveled and decrepit, not unlike what one would expect from those who live in death. He has long claws for hands, and 3 clawed toes on each foot. He also has a significantly hunched back and elongated neck. All of this seems to indicate he should be antithetical to the Golden Order, but the statue also has branches forming around him.
Or it's just the reused asset of the Londor pilgrims without as much of a shell on their back. But no, in all seriousness, Elden Enthusiast, welcome back to the stream. Nice to have you again. What was I going to say about Rosus that I lost for my stupid joke? Oh, yeah. So, one of the weirder things to me, and Square Table Gaming might go into this in a moment here, is that the light that they shine in the catacombs uses the modern Erdtree worship sigil, which suggests that it was a post-Age of Plenty post Age of Abundance type of timeline, where some of these statues may have been erected down in the catacombs, or maybe they had their own lights and then they just got retrofitted by the adherents of the Erd Tree to look like that. I think is another possibility, but there's no visual indicators to suggest that outright, and so I don't really believe that personally. So just to kind of clarify things here, while they use the modern Erd Tree worship sigil, that doesn't necessarily mean that like it really like the Age of Abundance had already come to an end, but it probably implies that the Erd Tree's bounty had like already dried up. So they could have been installed between when Godfrey was still technically Elden Lord and after the Erd Tree stopped producing sap or amber, and between that time and before Radigan became Elden Lord, at the least.
Rosus himself wears a crown of branches. So why is it that this being guides us to catacombs with Erd Tree roots? Before fleshing this out anymore, we'll want to take a look at the only weapon in the game associated with this character, Rosus' axe. The description of this axe tells us, Usher of Death, Rosus, who shows the path to the catacombs throughout the lands between, is depicted on this ritual axe. The dead easily lose their way, and have always been in sore need of a guiding hand. The axe itself depicts what is meant to be Rosus, with a few skeletons reaching out toward him.
And the skeletons that he summons are those lost in death. Let me move the text out of the way. So Rosus' summons raise the axe aloft to summon those lost in death. And this, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't really know, is not a product of localization. It's pretty much as close to the Japanese as it should be, I think. So anyway, Elden Enthusiast has been working on their video each day again. You're hoping to get it done by February 1st. Nice. Yeah, if you ever finish your video and want me to review it, whether that be on stream or off stream, just let me know and I can try to give you some feedback.
And have always been in sore need of a guiding hand. The axe itself depicts what is meant to be Rosus, with a few skeletons reaching out toward him, and it comes with the Ash of War, Rosus' summon, which is an exact copy of the Tibia's summon spell. This spell tells us, the dead have long been left to wander. What they need is leadership. This lines up well with Rosus' title of Usher of Death. He himself is not one of those who live in death, but he is instead a guide, helping these spirits reach the Erd Tree roots where they might.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the Tibia Mariner spell also establishes that it summons those lost in death and not those who live in death, because when you do actually fight the Tibia Mariners, they most certainly summon those who live in death.
Find peace. If we also consider his statues casting light in the shape of the Erd Tree sigil in various heroes' graves, it seems clear he is directly associated with the Golden Order. It's hard to say when these statues were created, as we don't have a strong grasp on how far the roots of the Erd Tree stretch across the lands between. It's possible they reach out to the entire land, but there's also the notion that the roots we find in some catacombs are those of the minor Erd Trees, so it's possible these statues may have been erected post-shattering. That said, the presence of Rosus statues in the heroes' graves points more heavily toward the image of Rosus being around pre-shattering. This means these statues may have been adopted as guides to the Erd Tree roots later on.
And for what it's worth, the fact that they don't use the ancient Erd Tree sigil, which has like the full tree on it, I think is indicative that these are somewhat later additions to the catacombs, or maybe the catacombs are just like later things relative to the timeline, but at the very least, they don't actually show the Golden Order fundamentalist sigil shining down there in the catacombs, which in some ways would make a lot of sense if they did use that, because the Golden Order could be against those who live in death or things that exist beyond life's bounds. And it would make sense that they would want to quell an uprising of an undead army or whatnot. Maybe the mariners were corrupted by Deathroot and are guiding souls to live in death. Maybe. Actually, if I remember correctly, Tibia mariners don't take bonus damage from a litany of proper death. I know I have tested this. Let me look it up. There we go. Oh yeah, so the Tibia Mariner only takes 70 points of damage, whereas the Skella Snail takes 700 points of damage. So Tibia Mariners are technically not those who live in death, although for some reason Deathbirds are. They take the bonus damage, which doesn't make any sense to me. Where's my chat? Okay. Yeah, and they do drop Deathroot at least. Yeah, that's an interesting point now that you say it. Because, yeah, they do certainly have some strange connections to those who live in death. But this could be like a square rectangle thing, which I always bring up, where like maybe there's an overlap between those lost in death and those who live in death. And those who live in death could be those lost in death who are specifically infected by Deathroot to kind of reanimate. All right, Elden Enthusiast, thanks for dropping by.
As to their purpose of guide and gatekeeper, we think it's fair to assume that Rosus' statues were meant to help travelers find their way to tree roots, in order to provide some with Erdtree burials. If the Golden Order wanted these places hidden from the common folk, activating and following Rosus' light would be a good way to lead their own people without making the knowledge of these locations readily available. So we have an idea of the purpose of Rosus and his statues, but who...
And one thing that's kind of bothered me is how the duelists of the Colosseum were transferred into the catacombs later on by Radagon and transformed into grave wardens. And I've wondered whether or not the purpose of the grave wardens is to keep things that are already in the catacombs within the catacombs, or to keep things out of the catacombs out of the catacombs. So both are very problematic for different reasons. And so if they're keeping things in the catacombs, that shows that things have been reviving in catacombs for a long time. But if they're keeping things out of the catacombs, is that because things aren't going back to the Erdtree and they're just like trying to essentially keep that secret for Radagon, whether or not they're aware of it? I don't know. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts on that.
Who was he in life, and why does he look like those who live in death? There is no written lore on the visage of Rosus, but we want to put forward a theory. Rosus does not exist. Or rather, he was never a real person.
So he could be like a dragon who like transformed into a human, potentially how Lansax is rumored to have done that. But setting that aside, I would kind of disagree that he looks like those who live in death beyond the whole like skeletal features, just because I would argue that those who live in death are just like spirit mist that inhabit bones, and I don't necessarily think they really have bodies. So I think that would kind of differentiate Rosus from them. But yeah, I don't know.
We believe that Rosus was created as a way of appropriating the religious depictions utilized by those who came before the Golden Order, when bodies were burned with ghost flame and the Deathrite birds ruled over death. This explanation can account for a few of the more eccentric design decisions behind the Rosus statues. His 5-clawed fingers, 3-clawed toes, and elongated neck can all be found on the Deathbirds as well. Pair this with a ghostly visage, and sprinkle in some details associated with the Erdtree, such as his tree branch crown and the branches around his body, and you have a recipe for rewriting history, a pastime we know the Golden Order was fond of. Rogier tells us how the Golden Order is willing to rewrite its rules and history to make itself stronger, and the adoption of Sarosh, Lord of Beasts, as King Regent shows us that the Golden Order is not above something like stealing the iconography of older religions in an attempt to wipe away their history. leaving nothing but their own religious beliefs alive and well. Keeping all of this in mind, we don't think Rosus ever truly existed. He is nothing more than a bastardized representation of the old ways of burning the dead in a different...
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with this, but it's also one of those ones where I don't have enough support for it to be fully on board with it either. It certainly does have a level of appeal for multiple reasons, because it would confirm in some ways that the catacombs would predate the whole Erdtree / Golden Order orders, and that makes a lot of sense for some reasons, but it also doesn't for others, because of like the whole lights. But that could have been retrofitted onto the Rosus statues, to be fair. But just the whole idea of when things are burned, I think, becomes another problematic point. And what I mean by that is, even now, when you go into the catacombs and like defeat the final bosses or whatever, you pick up spirit ashes. Ashes. These aren't like bodies, they aren't like puppets where you're like literally retrieving the corpses of those who've died and their souls are like kind of moved on but failed to get integrated into the tree roots. No, these things are ashes, which implies that they were burned, but for all we know, with the exception of Teach, Black Knife Teach, we don't know when any of the spirit ashes original owners died. With the added caveat of like what's her face, Loretta, no, not Loretta, the other girl, the Albinoric woman. I'm having a moment because I'm too tired. Anyway, the Albinoric woman becomes a spirit ash of her own volition, which is like a rare case. So except for her and Black Knife Teach, who we know died after like trying to run away on the night of the Black Knives or something like that. With the exception of those two, we have no idea when any of the other spirit ashes owners originally died, and or why they couldn't get integrated back into the Erdtree. So could they have all died post-shattering? Potentially, yes. Could some have died pre-shattering but didn't get integrated into the Erdtree because the Erdtree stopped accepting souls because like the Golden Order under Radagon changed things and didn't really need souls that way? Potentially, yes. And so those are like some of the questions that I've been trying to grapple with over the past few months. And Rosus and all of the, what are they called? The Erdtree burial avatars are problematic because it shows like glintstone was incorporated into these catacombs. And some of these catacombs should arguably predate Radagon and his study of glintstone sorcery and all that stuff. So there's just so much jank that goes into trying to piece together a proper narrative and timeline in relation to the catacombs and the dead that it's it's really difficult for me to commit to any one idea and without further elaboration by the DLC or the extra questions such a thing will bring. Yeah, Latenna, thank you. Don't you get Perfumer Trishas after you kill her? Yeah, and that's another funny one. So maybe there's two perfumers named Trisha, one that was already dead, and then the actual Perfumer Trisha. Yeah, because that one stood out to me like last month. I think I noticed that was a thing, that she exists and then you kill her and then you get her spirit ashes. Thanks for bringing that one back up, because that one's funny to me.
Cycle of reincarnation, warped to now lead others to continue feeding the Erdtree with the souls it needs to fuel its own cycle.
All right, and so yeah, the whole idea of them burning ashes, does that mean that even during the time of Radagon or post-shattering that they continued to burn the dead to create the spirit ashes, or is something else going on? It's baffling.
What do you think of our theory on Rosus, the Usher of Death? Do you believe he once existed and had the more literal job of leading those seeking Erdtree routes to their destinations? Or is he simply an invention of the Golden Order, meant to obscure history and twist it to their customs and traditions? Do you think Rosus could be tied more closely to those who live in death, or Fia, the deathbed companion? Were these statues erected across the lands between before or after the Shattering? There are no wrong answers, as the game does not provide much on Rosus, so we look forward to reading the wild speculation that's sure to be happening in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're always notified when we upload our newest episode.
Yeah, I'm less inclined to think that this is a post-Shattering addition to the catacombs, just because of the way that they interact with the imps and how a lot of the denizens of the catacombs and the lands between like lost their minds after the Shattering. Although there could have been a period of relatively stable minds which could have allowed that to happen. It just doesn't pass the vibe check for me personally.
Thank you again for joining us. We can't wait to see you again for more Elden Lore.
Alright, so that was another good video by Square Table Gaming. Thankfully, they didn't say that the Land of Reeds was Sekiro again. But in all seriousness, I did enjoy the video, so I'm going to go ahead and like it and share it with you all in the chat. I've already subscribed to their channel if you want to give them a sub as well. So, with that being said, we're pretty much right at the deadline for the stream for the night. So I'd like to thank all of you for dropping by and participating and all that fun stuff. We will be going live again at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so hopefully we will catch you then. So until then, hope you guys stay safe and take care. Last Protagonist out.